My name is Jasmine. I am 32 years old and the founder of a cybersecurity firm that I built entirely from the ground up. I did not inherit a trust fund. I did not have wealthy parents who could write a massive check when things got tough. I paid for my state college tuition by working double shifts at a local diner and writing complex code until my fingers cramped and my vision blurred. Now my company is valued in the tens of millions, and my proprietary security algorithms are sought after by the biggest tech giants and government agencies in the world. I created a predictive threat modeling system that stops hackers before they even breach a firewall. But to the Sterling family, I was just a charity case from the wrong side of the tracks. We were sitting on the sun-drenched patio of the most exclusive country club in Buckhead, Atlanta. It is the kind of place where memberships are passed down through generations, like sacred heirlooms, and new money is quietly sneered at behind linen napkins. The air smelled of expensive floral perfume and freshly cut grass. Across from me sat Vivian Sterling, my future mother-in-law. She was a woman who wore her old money arrogance like a second skin. Her posture was rigid, her pearls were genuine, and her smile never quite reached her cold, calculating eyes. Next to her was Richard, the family patriarch, who barely spoke, but managed to look down his nose at everyone around him. And then there was Chloe. She was Darnell's younger sister who had never worked a day in her life, but carried that custom designer bag like it was a hard-earned trophy. And sitting right beside me was Darnell, the golden boy of the Sterling family. He was the vice president of Sterling Wealth, a supposedly massive investment fund. When we first met at a tech seminar in Midtown, he seemed so different from the rest of his family. He was charming, attentive, and claimed he deeply admired my independence and fierce work ethic. He made me feel like my success was something to be celebrated rather than intimidated by. I truly believed we were building a partnership of equals. But as the wedding approached, the mask had started to slip, and his family's true colors were showing brighter and more toxic every single day. The waiter in a crisp white uniform cleared our appetizer plates, and Vivian took a delicate sip of her sparkling water. She looked at me with that familiar predatory glint in her eye. She loved to play this game in public spaces, where I was forced to maintain my composure and polite demeanor. "Jasmine, dear," she began, her voice intentionally loud enough for the neighboring tables of wealthy socialites to hear. "I was just telling the ladies at the country club board meeting about your little computer business. They found it so endlessly fascinating that someone from your modest background could make it this far in a man's world." I kept my expression entirely neutral, smoothly cutting into my grilled salmon. "It is a cybersecurity consulting firm, Vivian. And yes, the tech industry is growing rapidly. We just secured another massive contract last quarter." Vivian chuckled softly, exchanging a knowing, condescending look with Chloe. "It is just so different from what we are used to in our circle," she continued, wiping her mouth with a napkin. "The Sterling family has a certain legacy in Atlanta. Decades of Jack and Jill, chapters Ivy League endowments, generations of sophisticated wealth management. When Darnell told us he was marrying a girl who went to a state school, we were certainly surprised. But I suppose we live in a modern world now where pedigree means less than it used to." Chloe leaned forward, resting her manicured chin on her hands, acting as if she were genuinely curious. "Honestly, Jasmine, I do not know how you do it, working all those long, tedious hours staring at computer screens in the dark. It sounds utterly exhausting and frankly a bit masculine. Darnell tells us you even have massive servers set up in your own townhouse. That is so bizarre to me. Why not just rent a commercial office space like a normal business owner?" I felt a sharp prickle of irritation, but I smoothed it away with a practiced smile. "My servers require a proprietary cooling and security system that I custom-built myself," I explained patiently, keeping my tone light. "Keeping them at my townhouse allows me to personally monitor the physical firewall protocols 24 hours a day. It is highly classified client data, and I do not trust third-party commercial buildings with that level of sensitive information." Richard finally spoke up, his deep voice dripping with unquestionable authority and condescension. "Well, you will need to leave all that tech nonsense behind once you officially marry into this family. A Sterling wife has strict social obligations. charity galas, board meetings, philanthropic committees, and hosting duties. You will not have the time or the energy to be tinkering with computers in a basement like a teenager. I looked over at Darnell, fully expecting him to defend me. Expecting him to proudly state that my tinkering was about to land a multi-million-dollar federal contract that would dwarf his own salary. I waited for the man who promised to support my dreams to shut down his parents' disrespect. Instead, he just squeezed my hand under the table and offered a weak, apologetic smile. "Dad has a point, babe," Darnell murmured, avoiding my direct gaze. "We are going to have a very busy social calendar once we are married. You might need to step back from the day-to-day operations of your company. Maybe hire someone else to run the servers so you can focus on your new role in the family." The sheer audacity of his comment left me momentarily stunned. Step back from the company I built with my own blood, sweat, and tears. The company that was currently generating more liquid capital than his family's entire outdated wealth management portfolio. I took a deep, silent breath, preparing to politely but firmly remind them that my career and my company were absolutely not up for negotiation under any circumstances. Just as I parted my lips to deliver a sharp response, my smartwatch vibrated twice against my wrist. It was a custom haptic pattern I had programmed exclusively for high-level security alerts. I casually lowered my hand to my lap and tapped the glass screen, pretending to check the time. The message was from an unknown, heavily encrypted number. "Stay calm, they are recording you." My heart performed a violent stutter step against my ribs. I did not gasp. I did not look around wildly. Years of working in high-stakes cybersecurity had trained me to maintain an absolute poker face during catastrophic breaches. I was a seasoned professional at handling severe threats, but this threat was sitting at the table eating brunch with me. I took another slow sip of my mimosa, letting the cool, sweet liquid soothe my suddenly dry throat. I needed to assess the situation without alerting them that the dynamic had shifted. If someone was recording me, they wanted a specific reaction. Vivian's relentless prodding about my background, her deliberate attempts to humiliate me in front of the club members, Richard's demands that I abandon my career. They were trying to trigger an emotional outburst. They wanted the angry black woman stereotype caught on tape. They wanted me to yell, to throw my drink, to make a scene that would justify whatever twisted narrative they were trying to build against me. I set my glass down gently and let my gaze drift lazily across the table, performing a rapid visual sweep of the environment. I checked Richard's lapel for a hidden microphone. Nothing. I looked at Vivian's bulky diamond necklace. Clear. I scanned Darnell's tie clip. Nothing unusual. Then my eyes landed on Chloe's custom Birkin bag, resting conspicuously near the floral centerpiece. It was angled perfectly toward my face. To the untrained eye, it was just a ridiculous luxury accessory meant to show off their wealth. But I made a living finding hidden vulnerabilities in complex systems. I stared intensely at the gold hardware on the clasp. There, nestled flawlessly in the tiny gap between the leather and the metal, was a microscopic black lens. Every few seconds, a faint, nearly imperceptible red light pulsed. It was a high-definition hidden camera. The realization hit me with the destructive force of a freight train. This lunch was not a clumsy attempt at family bonding or a display of old money snobbery. It was a carefully orchestrated ambush. Every insult, every condescending remark about my state school education, every jab at my business was a highly calculated provocation. They were actively trying to gather video evidence of me being unstable, aggressive, or uncooperative. But why? Why go to such extreme lengths to record a conversation over an overpriced brunch? The answer had to be connected to the second part of the equation. Chloe asking specific targeted questions about my home servers. Darnell suggesting I step away from my company and hand over control. The pieces of the puzzle were rapidly falling into place, and the picture they formed was utterly terrifying. My perfect fiancé, the man who had proposed to me under the stars, the man who claimed to love my brilliant mind, was part of a coordinated malicious attack against me. They were not trying to welcome me into the sterling legacy. They were trying to dismantle mine and steal everything I had built. I felt a cold, dangerous calm wash over my entire body. The profound hurt and betrayal were immediately compartmentalized, locked away behind an impenetrable mental firewall. Right now, I could not afford to be a heartbroken fiancé mourning the end of her relationship. I had to be the ruthless CEO who routinely destroyed malicious hackers for breakfast. I looked right into the hidden lens on Chloe's bag and gave a warm, dazzling smile. "You know, Vivian," I said, my voice as smooth and sweet as honey. "You are absolutely right. The Sterling family legacy is truly something to behold. I am just so fascinated by how you all operate and manage your affairs. I cannot wait to learn all your little family secrets." Vivian blinked clearly, thrown off by my cheerful, agreeable response. She exchanged a confused, nervous glance with Richard. Darnell patted my hand, looking incredibly relieved that I had backed down so easily. None of them had any idea that they had just declared war on a woman who controlled and decimated digital ecosystems for a living. They thought they had successfully backed a helpless mouse into a corner. They did not realize they had just locked themselves in a cage with a lion, and I was about to tear their entire world apart. I picked up my fork and took another bite of salmon, chewing slowly to buy myself a few more seconds to think. The patio around us continued its gentle hum of privileged conversation, completely oblivious to the silent warfare happening at our table. I focused on the rhythmic clinking of silverware and the soft jazz playing from the hidden outdoor speakers, using the ambient noise to ground myself. My mind was already racing miles ahead, calculating probabilities and mapping out defensive strategies. If they were recording me here to establish an alibi or a behavioral profile, what exactly were they doing elsewhere? The text message had urged me to stay calm, implying that the danger extended far beyond this ridiculous brunch. I needed to get away from this table without arousing suspicion, but I also needed to gather more intelligence. I smiled at Darnell, leaning in close to project the image of a smitten bride-to-be. The scent of his expensive cologne, which used to bring me comfort, now turned my stomach. The game had fundamentally changed, and it was time for me to make my very first move. Darnell shifted uncomfortably beside me before I could even process my next move. His phone vibrated violently against the heavy linen tablecloth, loudly breaking the tense atmosphere we had just settled into. He glanced down at his screen, and his perfectly sculpted features twisted into an expression of exaggerated panic. He let out a loud, theatrical sigh and ran a neatly manicured hand over his face. "Babe?" "I am so incredibly sorry," he said, leaning in to press a quick kiss to my cheek. His lips felt like ice against my skin. "It is the Henderson account. They are facing a massive liquidity crisis right now, and I have to take this call immediately. It is a critical client emergency. Please excuse me for just a few minutes. I will be right back." He did not even wait for my response. He stood up hastily, buttoning his tailored suit jacket, and offered a thoroughly practiced look of apology to his parents. Vivian waved him off with a benevolent, understanding smile, playing the role of the proud mother, supporting her hard-working executive son. Darnell turned and strode quickly toward the club's private terrace, disappearing behind a set of heavy glass doors. The timing was far too perfect. A critical client emergency on a Sunday afternoon, right in the middle of a highly orchestrated family interrogation. My instincts, honed by years of predicting and neutralizing cyber threats, screamed that his departure was a designated cue. I looked back at Vivian and Chloe. They were both watching me with an unnerving, predatory stillness. They were waiting for me to crack, waiting for me to show irritation or anger at being abandoned by my fiancé during their relentless verbal assault. I gave them exactly the opposite. "If you ladies will excuse me for just a moment," I said, keeping my voice light and entirely unbothered. "I need to visit the powder room. I will be right back, and we can continue our lovely conversation about the Sterling family legacy." I stood up smoothly, picking up my clutch, and walked away from the table with my head held high. I could feel their eyes burning into my back, no doubt capturing my retreat on that hidden camera. I kept my pace measured and graceful as I navigated through the maze of dining tables, offering polite nods to the wealthy patrons lunching around me. But the second I pushed through the heavy oak doors of the ladies' room, my entire demeanor changed. The luxurious bathroom was entirely empty, smelling faintly of expensive jasmine soap and bleached marble. I bypassed the ornate vanity mirrors and went straight for the furthest handicap stall. I slipped inside, locked the heavy wooden door, and leaned back against the cool partition. My hands were perfectly steady as I unzipped my clutch and pulled out my primary secure smartphone. I tapped the screen expecting to see a follow-up message from my unknown informant. Instead, the notifications waiting on my lock screen made the blood completely drain from my face and my stomach drop into a bottomless abyss. I had 15 missed calls. They were not from a person. They were automated high-priority distress signals from Aegis, the proprietary artificial intelligence security grid I had custom-built for my townhouse. My thumbs flew across the screen, bypassing the standard biometric locks and entering my 12-digit emergency override code. The Aegis dashboard loaded instantly, flashing a blinding angry red across the interface. The alert logs cascaded down my screen in real time, painting a terrifying picture of a sophisticated targeted attack. Alert. Perimeter breach detected at rear entry. Alert. Secondary physical firewall bypassed. Alert. Motion sensors triggered in Sector 4. Alert. Unauthorized proximity to primary server rack. Sector 4 was my basement. Sector 4 was the heavily fortified climate-controlled vault where I housed the physical servers containing the source code for my entire life's work. Someone was inside my house. They had not just broken a window or picked a lock. They had bypassed a military-grade physical security system that I had personally designed. The only way someone could have bypassed the outer perimeter alarms without triggering a neighborhood lockdown was if they possessed my exact alphanumeric codes and an authorized digital encryption key. There was only one other person on the face of the earth who had access to my home network at that level of clearance: Darnell. My mind raced back to the late nights we had spent in my living room. I remembered the times he would bring me coffee while I coded, asking seemingly innocent, fascinated questions about my security protocols. He had asked about the server cooling mechanisms, the fail-safes, the magnetic lock overrides. I had thought he was taking a loving interest in my passion. I had thought he was trying to understand my world. Instead, he was performing detailed reconnaissance. He was mapping my defenses. Before the crushing weight of that betrayal could fully paralyze me, my phone vibrated in my palm. It was another text message from the same unknown, heavily encrypted number that had warned me about the camera at the table. I opened the message. The words on the screen confirmed my absolute worst fears and shattered the final illusion of my impending marriage. Keep them talking. Keep them. Darnell is using this lunch as an alibi. They are at your house stealing your source code right now. I stared at the glowing white text against the dark screen, reading the words over and over until they burned themselves into my retinas. They are at your house stealing your source code. Everything snapped into sharp, devastating focus. The entire relationship, the charming meet cute at the tech seminar, the whirlwind romance, the lavish proposal under the stars. It was all a meticulously crafted lie. Darnell Sterling did not love me. He did not admire my mind or cherish my independence. I was never his partner. I was his target. My newly patented cybersecurity algorithm was a revolutionary piece of technology. It was capable of predicting and neutralizing cyber attacks through adaptive machine learning before a threat even materialized. Industry analysts had already projected its valuation in the tens of millions of dollars within its first year on the open market. It was my masterpiece, the key to securing my future and cementing my legacy in the tech industry. And the Sterling family wanted it for themselves. I closed my eyes, piecing together the timeline of the ambush. They needed physical access to my servers to copy the raw, uncompiled source code directly from the hardware, bypassing the cloud defenses I had heavily fortified. To do that, they needed me out of the house for a guaranteed, uninterrupted window of time. That was the sole purpose of this ridiculous, torturous Sunday brunch. Vivian and Chloe were never meant to welcome me into their elite social circle. They were assigned to keep me distracted, to keep me trapped at that table under the guise of wedding planning and social posturing. The hidden camera in Chloe's luxury handbag was not just a tool to humiliate me, it was an alibi. It was irrefutable time-stamped video evidence proving that the entire Sterling family was peacefully having lunch at a public country club across town while my life's work was being actively plundered. Darnell taking a fake emergency call was his cue to coordinate the extraction team. He was standing out on that sunny terrace right now, communicating with the thieves inside my home, guiding them through the final layers of my security protocols, using the intimate knowledge he had extracted from me under the guise of love. A profound, suffocating silence settled over me inside that bathroom stall. The kind of silence that follows a massive explosion. The woman who had walked into this country club an hour ago, the hopeful, patient fiancé, trying desperately to win over her future in-laws, was dead. She had been completely eradicated by the truth. In her place stood the architect of Aegis. The woman who routinely dismantled international hacking syndicates and outsmarted the most dangerous cybercriminals on the dark web. I had spent my entire adult life building digital fortresses to protect multinational corporations from ruthless predators. I knew how to hunt, I knew how to trap, and I knew exactly how to destroy an enemy. The Sterling family thought they were dealing with a naive, desperate woman who would be too intimidated by their wealth and social standing to fight back. They assumed my state school background and lack of old money pedigree made me an easy mark. They drastically underestimated who they had invited to their table. They wanted my code. They wanted to strip me of my intellectual property, ruin my peace of mind, and leave me holding the bag while they profited off my genius. They thought they had backed a helpless mouse into a corner, completely unaware that they had just triggered a catastrophic defense sequence. I looked at the text message one last time. Keep them talking. Whoever sent that message knew the Sterling family's playbook. They knew Darnell's exact strategy, and they were giving me the tactical advantage of awareness. I did not know who this mysterious ally was yet, but I knew exactly how to follow their instructions. I locked my phone screen and slipped the device back into my clutch. I took a deep breath, letting the icy, calculated rage flow through my veins, replacing the shock and the heartbreak. I adjusted my dress, checked my reflection in the polished metal of the stall door, and unlocked the latch. I walked out to the marble sinks and washed my hands, staring at my own eyes in the mirror. They were completely devoid of fear. Darnell, Vivian, and Chloe were playing a high-stakes game of corporate espionage, but they had made one fatal miscalculation. They had targeted my network, and in my network, I am the absolute authority. I dried my hands, smoothed my hair, and pushed open the heavy oak doors to return to the dining room. It was time to go back to the table. It was time to smile at my enemies, sip my mimosa, and keep them talking while I prepared to spring a trap that would absolutely decimate the Sterling family empire. I pushed through the heavy mahogany doors of the country club and stepped back out onto the sprawling, sun-drenched terrace. The warm Georgia air brushed against my skin, carrying the scent of expensive cigars and blooming magnolias. I kept my posture perfectly aligned, my shoulders pulled back, and my expression arranged into a mask of serene, unbothered contentment. Every step I took toward our table was calculated. The patio was alive with the hushed, wealthy chatter of Buckhead's elite, the clinking of crystal champagne flutes, and the soft hum of background jazz. Nobody around me had the slightest clue that a high-stakes corporate heist was unfolding in real time. I approached our table, sliding back into my wrought iron chair, with the practiced grace of a woman who had absolutely nothing to hide and everything under control. Darnell was still missing, supposedly somewhere out of sight, handling his fabricated client crisis. Richard sat rigidly in his seat, repeatedly checking the face of his gold Rolex with a thinly veiled impatience. But Vivian and Chloe were practically vibrating with anticipation. They leaned toward my empty chair like predators waiting for their prey to wander back into the snare. Before I even had a chance to reach for my linen napkin and place it back onto my lap, Vivian made her move. She reached down into her oversized, custom-made designer tote bag and pulled out a thick, heavily bound stack of legal paper. With a sharp, aggressive, and highly deliberate motion, she slid the hefty document across the white tablecloth. It stopped directly in front of my plate, right next to my half-empty mimosa glass. I glanced down at the bold, imposing text stamped across the crisp front page. Prenuptial agreement. Vivian folded her hands together, resting them on the table, as a predatory, triumphant smirk twisted her perfectly lined lips. Darnell and Richard had their corporate lawyers draft this up last week. She announced, her voice intentionally elevated, deliberately carrying to the neighboring tables where several prominent socialites were pretending not to listen. We decided it was best to handle this little formality right now today before the wedding planning gets too complicated or emotional. Given your incredibly modest background, Jasmine, and the sheer overwhelming magnitude of the Sterling family assets, I am sure you understand why this is absolutely non-negotiable. Chloe leaned in, her eyes gleaming with malicious delight. She casually adjusted her custom Birkin bag, shifting it a fraction of an inch to my left. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was ensuring the tiny hidden camera lens was perfectly aligned to capture my face in high definition. "We really need you to sign it today," Chloe added, pushing a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen across the table until it touched my hand. "Right now, actually. It is just standard operating procedure for people in our specific tax bracket. You do not even need to bother reading the fine print. It just ensures that when the marriage inevitably hits a rough patch, you do not walk away with things you simply did not earn." The trap was so blatant, so aggressively hostile, that it was almost insulting to my intelligence. They had timed this ambush with absolute perfection. With Darnell conveniently absent, I was completely isolated against his hostile, scheming family. They were cornering me in a highly public space, presenting a legally binding document designed to completely strip me of my rights and my dignity, and demanding a blind signature on the spot. Any normal person would have flipped the table. Any self-respecting woman would have thrown the chilled mimosa right into Vivian's smug face, yelled at Chloe for her sheer audacity, and stormed off the country club patio in a blaze of righteous fury. And that was exactly what they were banking on. They desperately wanted the spectacle. They needed me to lose my temper to raise my voice, to become the aggressive, unhinged woman they wanted to portray me as. They were baiting me, hoping to capture my raw, unfiltered rage on that hidden camera. They wanted to weaponize my reaction to show Darnell, their wealthy friends, their corporate lawyers, and perhaps even a judge exactly why I was unstable, dangerous, and entirely unfit to carry the Sterling name. It was the ultimate character assassination, neatly packaged as a polite family lunch. But I was not a normal person, and I was certainly not going to play their rigged game. I did not flinch. I did not frown. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. Instead, I let out a soft, delighted musical laugh. I looked directly at Vivian with a smile so warm, so incredibly genuine, that it caused her smug expression to falter in utter confusion. "A prenuptial agreement," I said smoothly, my tone dripping with sweet, unbothered Southern charm. "Vivian, you are so incredibly thoughtful to bring this up. You are absolutely right, of course. Protecting high-value assets is the most vital step in any modern marriage. I actually deeply admire your foresight." I reached out and gently traced the edge of the thick legal document with my manicured fingernail, pretending to admire the heavy cardstock. Underneath the long drape of the tablecloth, safely hidden from the watchful eye of the hidden camera and their prying gazes, my left hand slid silently into my clutch. My fingers found the sleek, cold glass of my primary smartphone. Without ever breaking eye contact with Vivian, I unlocked the screen using the biometric scanner located on the back of the device. While I kept my face radiant, engaged, and perfectly pleasant, my thumb flew across the digital keyboard with lethal practice precision. I knew the Aegis security interface entirely by touch. I had painstakingly coded every single line of it myself. I bypassed the secondary firewall alerts that were frantically warning me of the breach. I deliberately dismissed the automated police dispatch protocols and navigated straight to the manual defense overrides. I did not want the local authorities showing up at my townhouse just yet. A loud, flashing police presence would scare the intruder away, and I wanted to catch this rat right in the exact middle of the maze. "We just want to make sure everyone is fully protected," Richard grunted, leaning forward and tapping his thick finger against the table to emphasize his authority. "Darnell has a massive legacy to inherit and protect. We simply cannot leave our empire vulnerable to an outsider with zero financial literacy." "Oh, I completely agree, Richard," I replied, my voice remarkably steady and light, carrying a tone of absolute professional agreement. "Security is my specialty after all. I believe in locking down vulnerabilities the second they are exposed. Under the table, my thumb swiped across the final glowing red command prompt on my screen. I selected a highly specialized extreme lockdown protocol that I had designed specifically for worst-case corporate espionage scenarios. I called it Mousetrap. With a single decisive tap, I authorized the execution. Miles away in my quiet, unassuming townhouse, the protocol engaged with brutal, unforgiving efficiency. I could picture the sequence perfectly in my mind's eye. The intruder down in my basement, currently attempting to bypass my reinforced server racks, was about to experience a terrifying reality check. The Aegis system instantly severed all local network connections, completely cutting off their ability to download, transfer, or transmit even a single kilobyte of my source code to an outside server. Then came the physical lockdown. Heavy reinforced magnetic blast doors dropped from the reinforced ceiling framing of the basement, slamming shut over the single exit with a deafening metallic crash that would shake the entire foundation of the house. The heavy-duty electronic deadbolts engaged simultaneously, sealing the vault tighter than a federal bank safe. The specialized ventilation system shifted immediately, dropping the ambient temperature in the climate-controlled server room down to a bone-chilling 40 degrees, to prevent the massive machines from overheating during a total lockdown. The intruder was trapped. They were completely isolated, locked inside a freezing, windowless concrete room with absolutely no physical way out. No network access to steal the data and zero cellular service to signal their accomplices for help. I felt the satisfying, heavy haptic vibration pulse against my palm. The notification confirmed the Mousetrap protocol was successfully deployed and the target was fully secured. The threat was neutralized. My algorithm, my company, and my future were safe. Now it was time to handle the immediate threat sitting right in front of me. I slowly pulled my hand out from under the table and picked up my mimosa glass. I swirled the orange liquid, letting the ice clink gently against the crystal rim. Vivian was still aggressively pushing the gold pen toward me, her fake tight smile beginning to visibly strain under the weight of my prolonged, cheerful silence. "Well, Jasmine," she prompted sharply, her tone losing its sugary veneer. "We do not have all day. Sign the document so we can finally order our entrees and move on with our lives." I brought the glass to my lips and took a long, refreshing sip, savoring the taste. I set the glass down precisely on the center of the coaster. Then I let the smile drop from my face completely. I looked dead at Richard. The sudden, cold, unyielding power in my gaze made him physically recoil in his expensive chair. I did not look at Vivian. I did not spare a single glance for Chloe or her hidden camera. I locked eyes exclusively with the man who thought he was running this entire criminal operation. "Richard," I said casually, letting my voice drop to a low, incredibly dangerous register that sliced right through the ambient noise of the patio. "You might want to check your phone." Richard's heavy, arrogant brow furrowed in deep confusion. He glanced sideways at Vivian, then looked back to me. "What on earth are you talking about?" he demanded, puffing out his chest. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the white tablecloth, interlacing my fingers, in a posture of absolute dominance. A slow, chilling smirk finally broke across my face. "I think Darnell just ran into a massive firewall at my house." The silence that fell over our table was absolute and suffocating. The color completely drained from Richard's face in a single terrifying instant, leaving him looking pale and sickly. Vivian's jaw actually went slack, her eyes widening in pure, unadulterated horror as my words processed in her brain. Chloe's hand slipped in shock, knocking the heavy gold pen completely off the table and onto the stone patio below. Before any of them could even formulate a coherent response, Richard's cell phone erupted. The loud, frantic, continuous ringing shattered the quiet elegance of the country club. He stared down at the caller ID flashing on the screen, his hands shaking so violently he could barely manage to hold the device. The game was over. I had just checkmated the Sterling family and they knew it. I did not wait around to watch Richard answer his phone. I pushed my chair back, the metal legs scraping sharply against the stone patio, and stood up. Vivian and Chloe were completely frozen, their mouths slightly parted in shock, unable to comprehend how their perfect trap had just snapped shut on their own fingers. I smoothed the front of my dress, offered them one final, devastatingly pleasant smile and turned my back on the Sterling family. I walked through the dining room with measured, confident strides. I did not run. Running was for prey. I was the predator now. By the time I reached the valet stand at the front entrance of the country club, my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my mind was utterly clear. The valet brought my car around, and I slid behind the wheel, tipping him generously, before tearing out of the circular driveway. I merged onto Peachtree Road, weaving aggressively through the heavy Buckhead traffic. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. The betrayal was a living, breathing thing inside the cabin of my car, but I refused to let it overwhelm me. Darnell had tried to rob me blind. He had used my affection, my trust, and my late-night coding sessions as a Trojan horse to infiltrate my life's work. He thought he could break into my home, steal my proprietary algorithm, and ruin my future while his mother and sister kept me distracted over avocado toast and mimosas. He was wrong. I pushed the accelerator down my sports car, roaring as I sped toward my townhouse. I expected to pull into my quiet, tree-lined street and find Darnell's sleek black Mercedes parked hastily by the curb. I fully expected to catch my treacherous fiancé, red-handed, trapped like a rat inside my basement vault, waiting for the police to arrive. But as I rounded the corner and aggressively pulled into my driveway, the street was completely empty. There was no getaway car. There was no sign of forced entry from the outside. The exterior of my modern brick townhouse looked perfectly serene, exactly as I had left it that morning. But I knew better. I approached my front door, ignoring the standard deadbolt, and pressing my thumb against the biometric scanner concealed beneath the porch light fixture. The system read my print, verified my retinal scan through the hidden lens, and unlocked the heavy steel-reinforced door with a solid, satisfying click. I stepped inside and immediately locked it behind me. The interior of my home was bathed in the eerie, pulsing red glow of the Aegis emergency floor lights. The house was in total lockdown mode. The air felt heavy, charged with the silent, invisible energy of a massive security event. I did not call out. I did not announce my presence. I moved silently through the hallway, heading straight for the basement door. This was the entry point to Sector 4. I pressed my palm against the secondary scanner, and the door clicked open, revealing the steep wooden staircase descending into the dark. I walked down the steps, my heels clicking softly against the wood, the only sound in the dead quiet of the house. At the bottom of the stairs stood the entrance to my server room. It was a massive industrial-grade magnetic blast door, resembling the entrance to a bank vault more than a residential basement. The heavy steel door was currently sealed shut, the magnetic locks engaged with thousands of pounds of force. A thick layer of condensation had already begun to form on the outside of the metal, a direct result of the freezing temperatures I had triggered inside the room. I stood before the keypad, my finger hovering over the glowing numbers. My chest tightened. Darnell was on the other side of this door. The man I had planned to marry, the man I had loved, was shivering in the dark, trapped by his own greed. I braced myself for the confrontation. I prepared myself to look into his eyes and watch him beg for mercy. I punched in my 12-digit master override code. The heavy magnetic locks disengaged with a loud clanking thud. The pneumatic seal hissed, releasing a thick cloud of freezing vaporized air into the hallway. I grabbed the heavy metal handle and yanked the blast door open. The server room was plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the frantic blinking blue and green LED lights of my massive server racks. The temperature inside was brutally cold, hovering right around 40 degrees. My breath plumed in white clouds in front of my face. I stepped into the freezing room, my eyes adjusting to the low light, searching for Darnell. But the man huddled in the corner, shivering violently and clutching his knees to his chest, was not my fiancé. I froze completely, thrown off balance for the first time all day. I reached out and slapped the wall switch, flooding the server room with harsh, bright fluorescent light. The man on the floor flinched, throwing his arms up to shield his face from the sudden glare. He was wearing a dark hoodie and tactical gloves, completely unequipped for the freezing temperatures I had subjected him to. He was sobbing, his teeth chattering uncontrollably, his breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. It was Tyrone, Chloe's husband, my future brother-in-law, the man who had married into the Sterling family 3 years ago and had spent every waking moment since trying desperately to prove his worth to a family that clearly despised him. I stared down at him in absolute shock. Tyrone was a notoriously broke, struggling real estate agent who was constantly drowning in debt trying to keep up with Chloe's lavish lifestyle. He was the family punching bag, the punchline to every one of Richard's cruel jokes. And here he was, locked inside my freezing server vault, shaking like a leaf. Resting on the concrete floor right next to his trembling boots was a heavy-duty decrypted hard drive. The transfer cable was still dangling from its port, violently yanked from my server rack, when the blast doors had slammed shut and severed the connection. He had been seconds away from stealing my entire algorithm. "Tyrone," I said, my voice echoing off the concrete walls, sharp and completely devoid of warmth. "What in the hell are you doing in my house?" He looked up at me, his eyes wide with raw, unfiltered terror. Snot and tears mixed on his freezing face. "Jasmine, please," he begged, his voice cracking violently as his teeth rattled together. "Please, you have to let me go. I am so sorry. I did not want to do this. I swear to God, I did not want to do this. He forced me. He said he would ruin me if I did not help him." "Who forced you?" I demanded, stepping closer, my shadow falling over his pathetic, shivering form. "Darnell," Tyrone sobbed, burying his face in his gloved hands. "Darnell set the whole thing up. He gave me your security codes. He gave me the exact bypass keys for the physical firewall. He told me exactly which server rack held the uncompiled source code. He mapped out the entire house for me. He promised it would take less than 10 minutes. My blood ran ice cold, freezing faster than the air inside the vault. "Where is Darnell right now?" I asked, my tone dropping to a dangerous, lethal whisper. "He was outside," Tyrone cried out, gesturing frantically toward the ceiling. "He was sitting right outside in the alley behind your house in his Mercedes. He was running the communication relay. He was supposed to guide me through the final extraction, while he kept his parents on the line at the restaurant to secure his alibi. But the second the alarms went off, the second those heavy metal doors slammed shut and locked me in here, my earpiece went totally dead. I heard his engine rev. I heard his tires screech. He sped off Jasmine. He left me here to take the fall. He abandoned me the second things went wrong." I stared down at the broken, sobbing man on my floor, and a profound, sickening realization washed over me. The entire dynamic of the Sterling family suddenly became crystal clear. The wealth, the country club memberships, the arrogant posturing, it was all a carefully constructed facade covering a deeply rotten, vicious core. They possessed a brutal, unforgiving class hierarchy within their own ranks. They did not just look down on outsiders who lacked their supposed pedigree, they actively exploited them. They brought people like Tyrone, and eventually me, into their toxic inner circle specifically to use us as disposable pawns. Tyrone thought he had hit the jackpot when he married Chloe. He thought he was marrying into a dynasty. Instead, he had married into a crime syndicate that used him as a human shield. Darnell had orchestrated this entire corporate heist, but he was too cowardly to get his own hands dirty. He had manipulated his desperate broke brother-in-law into doing the actual breaking and entering, knowing full well that if the alarms were triggered, Tyrone would be the one going to federal prison while Darnell maintained his perfect polished alibi sipping mimosas at the country club. They used the men and women who married into their family to do their dirty work. They viewed us as entirely expendable. I looked down at the decrypted hard drive resting on the freezing concrete floor. Then I looked back at Tyrone, who was currently begging for his freedom, begging me not to call the police, begging me not to ruin his life. He was absolutely terrified of me, terrified. But he was even more terrified of the Sterling family. In that freezing, brightly lit basement, the balance of power fundamentally shifted. Darnell thought he had escaped. He thought he had successfully fled the scene of the crime, leaving his disposable brother-in-law to face the wrath of my security system and the local authorities. He thought he was safe. He had no idea that by leaving Tyrone behind, he had just handed me the greatest weapon I could possibly ask for. I did not just have a trapped burglar in my basement, I had a star witness. I had a fully confessed co-conspirator who knew exactly how the Sterlings operated. I had the husband of the woman who had just tried to trap me with a hidden camera. I reached down and calmly picked up the decrypted hard drive holding the heavy metal casing in my hand. I looked down at Tyrone, my expression hardening into stone. "Stand up, Tyrone," I commanded, my voice echoing with absolute authority. He scrambled to his feet, swaying slightly, his body racked with violent shivers. He looked at me like I was an executioner preparing to drop the axe. "I am not going to call the police," I said slowly, letting every single word sink in. "I am not going to hand you over to the feds. I am not going to send you to prison for corporate espionage." Tyrone let out a massive, shuddering breath, his knees buckling slightly in pure relief. "Oh my God, Jasmine, thank you. Thank you so much. I promise I will never—" I held up a single finger, instantly silencing him. "I am not calling the police." I repeated, my eyes locking onto his. "Because you belong to me now. Darnell left you here to rot. Your wife's family treated you like garbage and used you as a disposable fall guy. But I am going to give you a chance to walk out of this freezing room a free man. You are going to tell me absolutely everything you know about Sterling Wealth. Every hidden bank account, every secret ledger, every single desperate scheme Darnell and Richard are currently running. You are going to give me the keys to their entire kingdom, Tyrone. And if you lie to me, if you try to warn them, if you even think about double-crossing me, I will hand this hard drive and the security footage of you breaking into my vault directly to the FBI." Tyrone stared at me, his shivering subsiding as the reality of his situation settled in. He was no longer a pawn in Darnell's game. He was the ultimate leverage in mine. He swallowed hard, nodding his head in rapid, desperate submission. "Whatever you need, Jasmine," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and newfound awe. "I will tell you everything." I smiled, a sharp, dangerous curving of my lips. "Perfect," I said, turning toward the heavy magnetic doors. "Now let us go upstairs and get you something warm to drink. We have a lot of work to do, and the Sterling family engagement gala is tomorrow night. I need to prepare my wedding gift." I marched Tyrone up the steep wooden stairs and into the blindingly bright, pristine expanse of my modern kitchen. He stumbled clumsily over the threshold, still shivering uncontrollably, wrapping his thick arms tightly around his torso. I pointed a single commanding finger toward a heavy oak bar stool positioned at the kitchen island. He collapsed into it, looking exactly like a drowned, pathetic rat. I walked over to the stainless steel espresso machine, my movements deliberate, precise, and entirely devoid of any urgency. I poured a steaming mug of black coffee and slid it smoothly across the cold marble countertop. Tyrone wrapped his gloved hands around the ceramic mug, desperately trying to absorb the radiating heat. "Start talking," I commanded, pulling out the stool opposite him and sitting down. I placed the heavy decrypted hard drive right on the marble surface between us. "You mentioned Darnell said he would ruin you. You mentioned he needed this done today. Why the sudden desperate rush? Why risk breaking into my highly secured house in broad daylight while I was supposed to be trapped at a family lunch?" Tyrone took a massive gulp of the scalding coffee, wincing sharply as it burned his throat. "They are desperate, Jasmine. Chloe has been crying every single night until she makes herself sick. Richard has been screaming at Darnell behind closed doors for weeks on end. They keep talking about shrinking margins and zero liquidity and some massive, crushing balloon payment that is coming due at the end of the month. Chloe maxed out 3 of my personal credit cards last week just to keep up appearances at the country club. Darnell told me your algorithm was the only viable way to save the family legacy." I leaned forward, studying his terrified, tear-streaked face. "Sterling Wealth manages billions of dollars in elite assets. They have an entire mirrored skyscraper downtown, with their surname plastered across the glass in massive silver letters. Are you seriously trying to sit there and tell me they need to steal my intellectual property to pay off country club credit card debt?" Tyrone shook his head violently, spilling drops of coffee onto the pristine counter. "I do not know the exact numbers. They treat me like an absolute idiot. They never show me the actual books or the raw accounting data. but I know they are terrified. Richard had to quietly sell the family yacht last month, and he made us all sign strict non-disclosure agreements claiming it was just undergoing a lengthy mechanical refit down in Miami. Darnell is barely sleeping. He paces the hardwood floor all night long. He said your code was worth tens of millions of dollars to the right overseas buyer. He already lined up a shady Russian tech firm willing to wire the funds to an untraceable offshore account the absolute second the raw code was verified. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it made my blood boil in my veins. Darnell was going to sell my life's work to a foreign syndicate, pocket the massive cash payout, and leave me with absolutely nothing but a shattered career. And he was doing it to plug leaking holes in a sinking ship. But Tyrone's fragmented, panicked story did not give me the full verified picture. I needed raw, undeniable data. I needed account numbers. I needed leverage that I could verify and weaponize against the Sterling family empire. I stood up quickly, grabbing the hard drive off the counter. You are useless, Tyrone. You only know the symptoms, not the actual disease. If you cannot give me actionable, concrete intelligence, I might as well hand this drive over to the federal authorities right now and let you rot in a cell. Tyrone bolted upright, knocking his coffee mug completely over. The dark liquid spilled across the white marble, dripping onto the floor. No. Please. I can get you direct access to Chloe's laptop. I can get you the bypass codes into Richard's home office. Just give me a chance to prove my worth. Before I could respond to his pathetic begging, a sharp, piercing chime echoed loudly through the kitchen. It was the Aegis perimeter alert. Someone had just breached my front gate. I raised my hand, silencing Tyrone instantly. I tapped my smartwatch, bringing up the high-definition front porch camera feed. A woman was standing directly on my doorstep. She was exceptionally well-dressed, wearing a tailored emerald green trench coat and oversized dark designer sunglasses that obscured half of her face. She held a thick, heavy leather briefcase tightly under one arm. She did not look like local police, and she certainly did not look like a member of the Sterling family. My secure smartphone buzzed sharply in my pocket. I pulled it out and opened the encrypted messaging app. A new text had just arrived from the exact same anonymous, untraceable number that had warned me about Chloe's hidden camera and Darnell's coordinated break-in. The message contained 3 simple words: "Let me in." I looked from the glowing phone screen to the live security feed. This was the ghost who had been feeding me critical intelligence all afternoon, the unseen ally who had given me the tactical advantage to outsmart the Sterlings at their own twisted game. "Get into the pantry," I ordered Tyrone, pointing firmly toward the heavy wooden door beside the stainless refrigerator. "Do not make a single sound. If I hear so much as a heavy breath coming from in there, I will lock the exterior deadbolt and immediately dial 911. Tyrone nodded frantically, scurrying off his stool and locking himself inside the dark, walk-in pantry without a single word of protest. I smoothed the front of my dress, took a deep centering breath, and walked down the hallway to the front entrance. I disabled the biometric lock and pulled the heavy steel door open. The woman stepped inside and immediately removed her oversized sunglasses, revealing sharp, piercing brown eyes and a face that was strikingly beautiful, but clearly hardened by undeniable pain and betrayal. She looked at me with an expression of mutual respect and weary, battle-tested understanding. "Jasmine," she said, her voice smooth and carrying a distinct, commanding air of authority, "I am incredibly glad to see you made it out of that miserable country club patio in one piece. And I am assuming by the distinct lack of flashing police sirens you managed to catch the rat in your basement." I crossed my arms over my chest, blocking the entryway to the rest of the house. "Who are you? And how do you know so much about my custom security system and Darnell's exact daily schedule?" The woman offered a bitter, highly knowing smile. "Because I designed the original cybersecurity protocols for his father's firm. And because I know exactly how Darnell Sterling operates when he thinks he has cornered a smart, successful woman." She extended a perfectly manicured hand. "My name is Simone. I am Darnell's ex-wife." I stared at her extended hand, my mind racing at maximum capacity to process the massive revelation. Darnell had explicitly and repeatedly told me he had never been married. He claimed he had spent his entire 20s exclusively focused on building his career and waiting for the right woman to share his life. It was just another flawlessly executed lie in an endless sea of corporate deception. I accepted her handshake, feeling the firm, confident grip of a woman who had fought her own brutal wars. I stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter my home. Simone walked past me, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. I locked the front door behind us and led her directly into the kitchen. She glanced at the spilled coffee on the marble island and the tightly closed pantry door, a flicker of dark amusement passing over her elegant face. "I see you already started the interrogation phase," Simone noted, placing her heavy leather briefcase right next to the puddle of coffee. "Let me save you the trouble of torturing whatever miserable lackey Darnell sent to do his dirty work today. I have absolutely everything you need right here in this bag." I leaned back against the counter, crossing my arms defensively. "Darnell told me he was never married. He completely erased you from his entire personal history." Simone let out a harsh, humorless laugh that echoed in the large kitchen. "Of course he did. The Sterling family specializes in legally and socially erasing people who no longer serve their direct financial interests. 4 years ago, I was exactly where you are today. I was a highly successful independent cybersecurity consultant. I fell for his manufactured charm, his fake vulnerability, and the grand illusion of his massive corporate empire. We were married for exactly 14 months. She unclasped the heavy brass buckles of her briefcase, her movements sharp, practiced, and highly deliberate. The second we tied the knot, the systemic sabotage began. They convinced me to legally merge my independent firm with Sterling Wealth under the guise of an exclusive corporate partnership. They promised me massive global expansion and a permanent seat on the executive board. Instead, Richard and Darnell used a complex labyrinth of shell companies to quietly drain my corporate accounts dry. They stole my proprietary client list, poached my top software developers, and forced me into a legal corner. When I finally figured out what was happening and threatened to go to the federal authorities, Vivian and Chloe launched a full-scale social warfare campaign against me. Simone's eyes darkened with raw, unhealed anger. They planted vicious fabricated stories in the Atlanta business journals claiming I was actively embezzling funds. They fed rumors to the Buckhead elite that I was fundamentally unstable and having a severe mental breakdown. They completely froze my assets, locked me out of my own corporate accounts, and threatened to ruin my professional reputation permanently if I did not sign a non-disclosure agreement and walk away with absolutely nothing. They stripped me of everything I had built, cast me out of high society, and left me completely bankrupt. She looked up at me, her expression hardening into absolute unyielding resolve. I spent the last 4 years living in the shadows, quietly tracking their movements, tracing their offshore accounts, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. When I saw Darnell targeting you, another brilliant self-made woman in the tech sector, I knew exactly what they were planning. I knew I had to intervene before they destroyed your life the exact same way they destroyed mine. Simone reached deep into her leather briefcase and pulled out a massive, intimidating stack of heavily bound folders. She dropped the entire stack onto the marble island. The heavy thud echoed through the silent kitchen. "These are forensic accounting files," Simone announced, tapping the top folder with a bright red fingernail. "I have spent years quietly infiltrating their supposedly secure financial networks. The great Sterling Wealth empire is a complete and total mirage. It is a fragile house of cards, held together by spit duct tape and desperate systemic fraud." I stepped closer to the island, pulling the top folder open. The crisp white pages were filled with highlighted bank statements, offshore transfer logs, and highly confidential internal company memos. I scanned the numbers, my eyes widening as the true scale of their massive deception became undeniably clear. "Sterling Wealth is practically insolvent," Simone explained, pointing to a sprawling ledger detailing massive sustained corporate losses. Richard made a series of catastrophic commercial real estate investments 5 years ago and tried to cover the massive losses by illegally dipping into his clients' private trust funds. He created a literal Ponzi scheme within his own wealth management firm. To keep the grand illusion alive, Darnell has been secretly mortgaging every single physical asset the family owns. Their Buckhead estate, the exclusive country club memberships, the luxury cars, they are all heavily leveraged to the absolute maximum limit. They do not own a single thing outright. I flipped the page, staring at a deeply buried, heavily encrypted liability report. This shows a $15 million deficit, I said, my voice barely above a shocked whisper. They are $15 million in the red. Exactly, Simone confirmed, her eyes gleaming with vengeful, righteous satisfaction. They are drowning. That balloon payment Tyrone probably babbled about is due at the end of this month. If they do not come up with $15 million in liquid cash, the banks will aggressively foreclose on everything, and their wealthy clients will realize their money is completely gone. But the financial ruin was only the beginning of the nightmare. Simone pulled out a separate, much thinner folder stamped with a highly classified federal watermark. "This is the real prize," she said, sliding it slowly toward me across the marble. "The FBI has been quietly monitoring their suspicious offshore transfers for the past 8 months. Richard and Darnell are currently the prime targets of a massive federal wire fraud investigation. The feds are just waiting to build an airtight, undeniable case before they issue the final indictments." Everything snapped into sharp, brutal focus. The rushed, extravagant wedding. The sudden intense interest in my proprietary predictive algorithm. The aggressive prenuptial agreement they tried to force me to sign at the country club today. They did not just want to steal my code to get richer. They needed my algorithm to literally save their lives and keep them out of federal prison. They needed a massive, untraceable influx of cash from a foreign buyer to cover their $15 million deficit and flee the country before the FBI kicked down the heavy glass doors of their corporate headquarters. I was never a bride to them. I was a financial life raft. I closed the folder and looked directly at Simone. We were two strong, intelligent women who had been targeted, used, and marked for destruction by the exact same arrogant men. But they had severely underestimated us. They thought we were weak. They thought we would cower in the face of their fake money and their fabricated social status. "They are hosting an engagement gala for us tomorrow night at the Sterling Estate," I said, a slow, predatory smile creeping across my face. "They invited half of Atlanta's elite to show off their new addition to the family." Simone mirrored my smile, her eyes shining with the promise of absolute ruin. "I think it is time we give the Sterling family a celebration they will truly never forget." I reached into my designer clutch, my fingers wrapping around the thick, heavy cardstock of the prenuptial agreement Vivian had so aggressively shoved in my direction just an hour ago. I had slipped it into my bag right before I walked away from their table, knowing instinctively that it was the final missing piece of their elaborate puzzle. I tossed the bound document onto the marble kitchen island right beside Simone's staggering mountain of forensic accounting evidence. The heavy thud of the paper contrasted sharply with the sleek, quiet elegance of my home. "Let us take a look at the exact mechanism they plan to use for my execution," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Simone leaned over the island, her sharp eyes scanning the imposing cover page. She let out a dry, humorless scoff that echoed in the spacious kitchen. She reached into her trench coat pocket and produced a sleek silver fountain pen. She clicked the cap off with a sharp snap. "I know the law firm that drafted this garbage," Simone stated, flipping past the first several pages of standard boilerplate legal introductions. "They are the exact same high-priced, morally bankrupt corporate sharks Richard used to dismantle my company. They do not write prenuptial agreements to protect assets, Jasmine. They write them to completely neutralize threats and enslave liabilities. Let us see exactly how deep they were trying to bury you." We stood shoulder to shoulder under the bright recessed kitchen lighting, two women, united by the exact same betrayal, dissecting the contract line by line. The legal jargon was incredibly dense, deliberately obfuscated by layers of confusing circular terminology and endless subsections. It was meticulously designed to overwhelm the reader, to make the eyes glaze over, so the victim would simply sign on the dotted line to make the headache go away. Vivian ambushing me at a public restaurant with Chloe filming my reaction was a highly calculated distraction technique. They wanted me so enraged by their blatant disrespect that I would sign it blindly just to throw it back in their faces, or reject it entirely and look like a gold digger on camera. But stripped of its intimidating language, the document was nothing more than a masterclass in financial predation. Simone's silver pen traced down to page 14, stopping abruptly under a section titled Matrimonial Liability Equalization and Shared Institutional Debt. She tapped the paper sharply. "Here is the first trap," Simone said, her voice dropping into a deadly serious register. "Look at this phrasing right here. It stipulates that upon the legal solemnization of the marriage, any pre-existing institutional liabilities held by the primary stakeholder, which they legally define as Darnell, become immediately and irrevocably absorbed into the shared marital estate." I leaned in closer, reading the dense text over and over again, until the true, horrifying reality of the words burned into my brain. They were not trying to protect Darnell's supposed millions from me. They were legally binding me to his massive, crushing failures. If I had signed this document and married him next month, I said, my voice barely a whisper, as the sheer magnitude of the evil washed over me, I would have instantly assumed 50% of their $15 million hidden debt. Exactly! Simone confirmed, her eyes blazing with a fierce, protective anger. You would have walked down the aisle a wealthy, independent, self-made woman, and you would have walked out of the reception completely bankrupt. The second the ink dried on your marriage certificate, Darnell's creditors would have had full, unhindered legal authorization to drain your personal savings, seize your business accounts, and place a lien on this very townhouse to satisfy his family's toxic debt. You would have been entirely responsible for a sinking ship you did not even know you were on. My stomach churned with a violent mixture of profound disgust and blinding rage. I thought back to the cake tastings, the elegant floral arrangements, the late nights Darnell spent whispering in my ear about our beautiful future together. Every single kiss was a calculated lie. Every romantic dinner was a strategic maneuver. He had never looked at me and seen a partner. He had looked at me and seen a human sponge, someone he could toss onto a $15 million grenade to absorb the blast while his family walked away completely unscathed. But they did not just want my money to pay their debts. They wanted my mind. I flipped the heavy pages forward, scanning the document with the trained, hypervigilant eyes of a cybersecurity architect. I was used to hunting for deeply buried malicious code inside complex software systems. Hunting for a malicious clause in a legal document required the exact same skill set. I found it buried on page 27, tucked inconspicuously underneath a section broadly labeled Asset Management and Future Endeavors. Look at Clause 12, I instructed, sliding the document back toward Simone. The section on intellectual property. Simone adjusted her posture, reading the paragraph aloud. Her voice grew colder and sharper with every single syllable. Any software, digital algorithm, proprietary code, or technological asset developed, conceptualized, or patented by either party during the courtship or engagement period shall be licensed in perpetuity, irrevocably, and exclusively to Sterling Wealth Management for the express purpose of familial asset protection and corporate portfolio enhancement. Simone dropped the pen onto the marble counter. It clattered loudly against the stone. She looked up at me, pure revulsion etched across her face. They were going to legally steal your algorithm, Simone stated flatly. I stared blindly at the crisp black ink on the page, feeling a cold, dark fury settle deep into my bones, completely replacing the shock. The plan was flawlessly evil. The break-in currently failing down in my basement was just their messy backup plan. This contract was their primary weapon. If I had signed this document, I explained, my voice completely devoid of warmth, Darnell would not have even needed to hire his desperate brother-in-law to break into my server room. The second we said our vows, Sterling Wealth Management would have held the absolute exclusive licensing rights to my entire cybersecurity software. I would have legally handed them the keys to my own kingdom. They planned to take my revolutionary predictive algorithm and immediately sell the exclusive rights to that shady overseas tech firm Darnell had lined up. They would have collected a massive, untraceable offshore payout, easily covering their $15 million deficit and silencing the FBI wire fraud investigation before the federal agents could even issue a subpoena. They would save the precious Sterling family legacy using my genius, and I would be left legally barred from ever profiting off my own creation. I would be trapped in a marriage entirely constructed on debt, completely stripped of my intellectual property, and entirely powerless to fight back because I had signed the rights away on a sunny patio at the country club. It was not just a heist. It was an attempted total erasure of my identity. They wanted to consume me entirely. They wanted to take my money, my talent, my security, and my dignity and use it all as fuel to keep their pathetic, fraudulent empire running for a few more years. They thought I was just a naive, love-struck girl who would be so intimidated by Vivian's aggressive posturing and Chloe's mean girl tactics that I would blindly sign my entire life away just to keep the peace. They had severely underestimated who they had invited into their home. Right at that exact moment, the heavy, stifling silence of my kitchen was shattered by a sharp, aggressive vibration. My secure smartphone was buzzing violently against the marble island right next to the damning prenuptial agreement. I glanced down at the glowing screen. The caller ID flashed in bright, bold letters. Darnell. Simone looked at the phone, then looked up at me, one perfectly sculpted eyebrow arching in a silent question. She crossed her arms, leaning back against the counter, clearly waiting to see exactly how I was going to handle the man who had just tried to orchestrate my total destruction. I did not hesitate. I cleared my throat, forcing the cold, calculated rage down deep into the pit of my stomach. I took a quick, centering breath, instantly shifting my entire demeanor. I let my shoulders drop. I widened my eyes and I completely erased the lethal architect of Aegis from my face. In her place, I resurrected the panicked, terrified, innocent fiancé Darnell firmly believed I was. I snatched the phone off the counter and tapped the green accept button, bringing the device to my ear. Darnell, I cried out, injecting my voice with a flawless, trembling note of absolute panic. My breathing was ragged and shallow, mimicking pure terror. Oh my God, Darnell, where are you? Jasmine, baby. Are you okay? Darnell shouted through the speaker. His voice was breathless, frantic, and dripping with an Oscar-worthy performance of masculine concern. He was panting heavily, clearly trying to sound as if he was running or fighting through traffic. The alarm company just called my cell phone. They said the Aegis system triggered a massive perimeter breach at your townhouse. They said the basement vault went into a total physical lockdown. I am speeding down Peachtree right now. Are you safe? Did someone break in? He was playing his role perfectly. He was playing the frantic, protective future husband rushing to the rescue, completely unaware that his own hired burglar was currently locked inside my freezing server room, spilling every single one of his family's dirty secrets. Darnell was establishing his alibi in real time, making sure there was a recorded phone call of him desperately trying to reach me while the supposed crime was taking place. I gripped the edge of the marble island, locking eyes with Simone across the counter. I am so scared, Darnell, I wailed, letting a fake sob tear through my throat. I am perfectly safe. I left the country club right after you took your client call because I felt sick, but the house is in total lockdown mode. The blast doors dropped. The red lights are flashing everywhere. Someone is trapped down inside the server vault. Oh my God, Darnell yelled, playing his part to the bitter end. Do not go near the basement, Jasmine. Do not open that door. I am 5 minutes away. I am coming to protect you, baby. I am rushing to you right now. Just stay right where you are. I will be waiting right here for you, baby. I whispered, keeping my voice incredibly small and fragile. Please, hurry. I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the red button, instantly cutting off the connection. The silence rushed back into the bright kitchen. I slowly lowered the phone, placing it back onto the marble counter next to the toxic contract. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the terrified fiancé persona instantly evaporate into the cool air. I straightened my spine, pulling my shoulders back. I looked across the kitchen island at Simone. The shared understanding between us crackled like live electricity. I did not need to say a single word. A cold, dangerous, incredibly sharp smile spread slowly across my face. The Sterling family thought they were playing a brilliant game of chess against a helpless pawn, but they had just walked blindly into a trap entirely of their own making. Darnell was 5 minutes away. He was rushing straight into my fortress, completely unaware that the woman waiting for him held the keys to his absolute destruction. The game had just begun. I moved with absolute precision. I shoved the decrypted hard drive and the toxic prenuptial agreement into Simone's heavy leather briefcase. Simone snapped the brass buckles shut and vanished toward the reinforced back exit, moving like a phantom. She knew exactly how to stay completely invisible. I locked the heavy deadbolt behind her. I returned to the kitchen, grabbed a microfiber dish towel, and rapidly wiped up the spilled coffee from the marble island. I marched over to the heavy oak pantry door where Tyrone was cowering. I pressed my mouth near the wood and delivered my final non-negotiable order. The police are pulling up right now. You are going to stay in this dark closet until they leave. If you make a single sound, I will tell the heavily armed officers you are a violent intruder and I feared for my life. Tyrone let out a muffled, pathetic whimper of absolute compliance. I turned away, gripping the edge of the kitchen island to steady myself. I needed to look the part of a terrified, helpless victim. I dragged my hands through my perfectly styled hair, tangling the strands wildly. I rubbed underneath my eyes, smudging my expensive mascara to simulate fresh, desperate tears. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I let my hands tremble visibly. The wail of police sirens pierced the quiet atmosphere of my upscale neighborhood. Red and blue lights flashed aggressively through the sheer curtains of my living room, painting the walls in erratic, frantic colors. The heavy screech of expensive tires tore through the driveway, followed instantly by slamming car doors. Heavy boots pounded against the concrete steps leading up to my front porch. My doorbell rang frantically, accompanied by loud, urgent knocking. I unlocked the deadbolt and threw the heavy steel door open. Darnell stood on my welcome mat, flanked by two uniformed Atlanta police officers. He looked absolutely frantic. His designer suit jacket was unbuttoned, his silk tie was slightly askew, and his chest heaved with manufactured exertion. He had clearly rehearsed this exact entrance in the rearview mirror of his Mercedes. The very second his eyes locked onto my smudged makeup and trembling frame, he lunged forward, wrapping his arms around me in a crushing, fiercely protective embrace. "Jasmine," he gasped out, burying his face in my tangled hair. "Thank God you are safe. I was absolutely terrified. I drove like a madman to get to you." I buried my face directly into his chest, clutching the lapels of his expensive suit. I let out a loud, shuddering sob, burying my absolute revulsion deep beneath layers of fake hysteria. He smelled like expensive cologne and corporate deception. I hated the feeling of his hands rubbing soothing circles onto my back. I hated the way he performed for the two police officers standing awkwardly on my porch. "Ma'am," one of the officers said, stepping inside with his hand resting cautiously on his utility belt. "We received the automated perimeter alert from your security provider. Are you injured in any way? Is there anyone else currently inside the residence?" I pulled back from Darnell just enough to look at the officer. I kept my desperate grip on Darnell's jacket, letting my hands shake violently against his chest. "I am not hurt," I stammered, my voice cracking perfectly. "I was alone. I came home from a lunch meeting because I felt unwell." The second I stepped inside the hallway, the red emergency lights started flashing. The automated voice warned of a physical breach in Sector 4. "That is my basement server vault." The officers exchanged a sharp professional glance. "Is the suspect still down there?" the second officer asked, drawing his weapon and gesturing toward the main hallway. I shook my head violently, letting more tears spill over my eyelashes and down my cheeks. "No. They got away." The Aegis system dropped the heavy magnetic blast doors instantly, but whoever was down there must have had a manual override jammer. By the time I pulled up the live security feed on my phone, the exterior basement hatch was blown wide open. The room was totally empty. The burglar triggered the emergency release and fled through the back alley before the police even turned onto my street. Darnell squeezed my shoulders tightly. His entire body tensed for a fraction of a second, and then a massive wave of profound relaxation washed through his muscles. I could literally feel the immense relief radiating off his frame. He believed every single word. He assumed Tyrone had successfully downloaded the algorithm, ripped the drive from the server, triggered a manual escape, and handed the data off to the dead drop location before fleeing the scene entirely. Darnell thought he had won. "Did they take anything valuable?" Darnell asked, injecting his voice with a thick, heavy layer of concerned outrage. He looked at the police officers playing the righteous protector. My fiancée builds proprietary cybersecurity systems for enterprise clients. Her hardware is worth millions. I wiped my eyes, keeping my face buried near his collarbone. I do not think so. I lied smoothly, letting out a ragged sigh. The vault engaged the absolute lockdown sequence before any physical servers could be removed. The data ports sever connection instantly during a breach. They might have grabbed a loose flash drive or some spare cables, but the core system is secure. They panicked and ran. I felt Darnell stiffen slightly at my words, a brief flicker of panic returning to his chest. If he thought Tyrone failed to secure the algorithm, his $15 million lifeline was gone. But I quickly added the final piece of bait to the trap. But I am so stupid, I cried out, burying my face deeper into his jacket. I was running a massive backup diagnostic this morning. The secondary localized firewall was totally disabled for routine maintenance. If they plugged a heavy-duty extraction drive directly into the main terminal before the blast doors dropped, they could have copied the uncompiled source code in under 3 minutes. I have to run a full diagnostic to see if the data was cloned, but the raw code might be out there. Darnell exhaled a long, heavy breath, resting his chin on the top of my head. The tension melted out of him completely. He had his confirmation. He believed Tyrone executed the extraction during the vulnerability window, grabbed the decrypted drive, and ran. Darnell believed he had the algorithm. He believed he had the key to save his family from federal prison. "It is going to be all right, baby," Darnell murmured, his voice rich with false, sickening comfort. "The most important thing is that you are completely safe. We can always rewrite code. We can always buy new servers. You are what matters to me. Let the police do their jobs. I am right here. I am not going anywhere." The officers requested to sweep the property just to be absolutely certain the perimeter was clear. Darnell offered to wait with me in the living room while they conducted their search. I nodded, playing the exhausted, traumatized victim to perfection. As Darnell guided me toward the plush velvet sofa, wrapping a heavy wool throw blanket gently around my shoulders, my internal monologue shifted entirely from the immediate performance to the long-term execution. I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady, calm rhythm of his lying heart. He thought he was the ultimate apex predator. He thought he had outsmarted a brilliant woman, secured his family's stolen wealth, and guaranteed his own freedom. My mind, however, was already operating 10 steps ahead, laying out the exact surgical strike that would obliterate the Sterling name from the face of Atlanta. Tomorrow night was the grand Sterling family engagement gala. They had rented out the entire crystal ballroom of the most exclusive private estate in Buckhead. They had invited city council members, wealthy socialites, and every single one of their high-net-worth investment clients. Richard and Vivian planned to parade me around the room like a conquered prize, a beautiful, intelligent trophy wife who would legitimize their family name and unknowingly absorb their massive toxic debt. Darnell planned to smile for the cameras, kiss my cheek, and quietly finalize the sale of my stolen algorithm to a foreign syndicate the very next morning. I was going to let them put on their custom tuxedos and their designer gowns. I was going to let Vivian wear her obscenely expensive diamonds, the ones bought with stolen client funds. I was going to let them fill that grand ballroom with their elite friends and their thoroughly defrauded investors. I was going to let Richard stand at the podium and raise a crystal champagne flute to their continued success and their unbreakable family legacy. And then, right in the middle of their perfect, glittering celebration, I was going to bring their entire empire crashing down to the earth. I had Tyrone locked in my pantry, terrified, broken, and fully prepared to testify against his own brothers-in-law to save his own skin. I had Simone, a brilliant, vengeful ghost, armed with mountains of forensic accounting evidence detailing every single fraudulent wire transfer and illegal offshore account. I had the toxic prenuptial agreement they tried to weaponize against me. I had the crystal-clear security footage of their hired burglar breaking into my vault and sobbing on the floor. I had the absolute, undeniable proof that Sterling Wealth Management was nothing but a desperate criminal enterprise running out of time. I would not just break up with Darnell. I would not just call the FBI and hand over the evidence quietly in a sterile office. That was too easy. That was too clean. They had tried to humiliate me, exploit me, and destroy my life's work. I was going to publicly execute their reputation in front of every single person they respected. I would hijack the gala's audiovisual system. I would project the $15 million deficit onto the vaulted ballroom walls. I would play the security footage of Tyrone weeping in my freezing basement. I would let their wealthy clients realize in real time that their life savings were completely gone. Darnell stroked my hair again, pressing a gentle, loving kiss to my forehead. I smiled against the expensive fabric of his suit, my heart beating with cold, lethal precision. He thought tomorrow night was the glorious beginning of his new life. I knew tomorrow night was his absolute final night of freedom. The Sterling family wanted to play a high-stakes game of corporate deception, and I was going to ensure they lost absolutely everything. The following evening, the Sterling family estate in Buckhead was transformed into a glittering fortress of extreme, unadulterated wealth. Valets in crisp white jackets rushed to park a seemingly endless procession of imported luxury vehicles along the winding oak-lined driveway. The manicured front lawns were illuminated by soft, ambient uplighting, casting long, dramatic shadows against the massive brick columns of the main house. Inside, 200 of Atlanta's most powerful politicians, aggressive venture capitalists, and untouchable socialites mingled beneath soaring crystal chandeliers. They were all sipping vintage champagne and eating beluga caviar, completely oblivious to the fact that they were standing on a financial fault line that was mere hours away from a catastrophic eruption. I arrived wearing a custom floor-length crimson silk gown that hugged my frame flawlessly, featuring a daring open back and a slit that demanded attention with every step. My hair was styled in an intricate sweeping updo, and my makeup was immaculate, hiding any lingering trace of yesterday's feigned trauma. I was the absolute picture of a radiant, blissfully happy future bride. Darnell met me at the base of the grand sweeping staircase, looking predictably dashing in a tailored velvet tuxedo jacket. He offered me his arm with a bright, predatory smile, leaning in to kiss my cheek. He whispered how stunning I looked, completely convinced that I was entirely his, safely subdued and entirely clueless. I smiled back, wrapping my hands around his bicep, leaning into his side with a perfectly practiced display of total adoration. We moved through the crowded ballroom, performing the exact routine the Sterling family demanded. Richard and Vivian intercepted us almost immediately, pulling us into a tight circle with a group of high-profile investment bankers. Vivian wore an obscenely large diamond necklace that caught the chandelier light, her face pulled into a tight plastic smile. She introduced me to the group as the brilliant new addition to the family, casually mentioning my successful tech firm, as if it were simply a charming little hobby that would soon be absorbed into the greater Sterling portfolio. Richard clapped Darnell on the shoulder, laughing loudly at a joke one of the politicians made, projecting the absolute image of a carefree patriarch whose empire was invincible. I played my part flawlessly. I laughed at the right moments, offered modest, gracious responses, and gazed up at Darnell with wide, trusting eyes. Every time Darnell looked down at me, I could see the arrogant victory swirling in his dark pupils. He thought the heavy lifting was over. He thought the extracted algorithm was safely secured in his offshore buyer's hands, and that this gala was simply the victory lap before the final payout. As a server passed by with a tray of fresh champagne flutes, I politely declined, letting my gaze drift casually across the expansive room. The catering staff moved with silent, synchronized precision, all wearing crisp black uniforms and white gloves. My eyes tracked a specific server moving methodically along the perimeter of the ballroom, offering hors d'oeuvres to the laughing guests. It was Simone. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly into a severe professional bun. Her striking features were completely devoid of makeup, blending her seamlessly into the background noise of the opulent party. No one in that room gave her a second glance. To the elite billionaires of Atlanta, the service staff were entirely invisible. Simone caught my eye for a fraction of a second. She gave a microscopic, barely perceptible nod before turning toward the arched hallway that led to the private residential wing of the estate. I squeezed Darnell's arm gently, leaning up on my toes. "I need to visit the powder room," I whispered, keeping my tone light and breezy. "Do not miss me too much." Darnell smiled, kissing my forehead. "Hurry back, baby. My father is going to make the big toast in about 15 minutes. I slipped away from the crowded circle, gliding gracefully through the sea of designer dresses and tailored suits. I maintained my pleasant, glowing smile, greeting a few acquaintances as I navigated toward the heavy oak doors that separated the ballroom from the private family quarters. The second I crossed the threshold into the quiet, dimly lit hallway, my posture instantly shifted. The fake, adoring smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hardened mask of absolute focus. Simone was waiting for me inside a small marble-tiled alcove near the guest restrooms. She held a silver serving tray perfectly balanced on one hand. As I approached, she smoothly lowered the tray, revealing a sleek black plastic keycard resting exactly in the center. I pulled it from the security chief's locker during the caterer setup. Simone whispered, her voice tight and rapid. It is a master override clone. It will get you through the biometric scanner on Richard's office door and bypass the secondary alarm system on his personal network. You have exactly a 12-minute window before the security team does their scheduled physical rotation through this wing. I slid the keycard smoothly into a hidden pocket, sewn seamlessly into the seam of my crimson gown. Is the extraction drive ready? I asked, keeping my voice equally low. Simone nodded, reaching into the pocket of her black apron and handing me a tiny, high-capacity quantum flash drive. It looked like a simple stick of dark metal, but it contained a localized decryption worm I had built specifically for this exact moment. The champagne tower is being wheeled out now, Simone said, stepping back out of the alcove and lifting her silver tray back into position. Richard is gathering the board members for his grand toast. Every single eye in this house is going to be glued to that stage. Get in, pull the unencrypted ledgers, and get out. We did not exchange another word. Simone turned and blended back into the flow of caterers moving toward the ballroom. I turned away from the restrooms and walked swiftly down the long, carpeted corridor leading to Richard Sterling's private sanctuary. The music from the ballroom became a muffled, rhythmic thumping as I moved deeper into the residential wing. I reached the end of the hall. Richard's study was secured behind a massive, solid mahogany door. Next to the brass handle sat a sleek, glowing biometric keypad. This was the nerve center of the Sterling operation. This was where the lies were manufactured, where the fake accounts were balanced, and where the fraudulent wire transfers were authorized. I pulled the cloned master keycard from my dress and swiped it firmly through the magnetic reader. A tiny green light flashed, followed by the heavy, satisfying click of the internal deadbolt disengaging. I pushed the door open, slipped inside, and closed it silently behind me, immediately locking it from the inside. The study was bathed in the soft ambient light of a single desk lamp. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with rare leather-bound volumes. A massive antique globe stood in the corner, reeking of old money and manufactured prestige. But my focus was entirely locked onto the sprawling, custom-built mahogany desk in the center of the room. Beneath the polished wood surface sat a high-end, heavily modified mainline server tower. Richard did not trust cloud storage for his actual unfiltered financial ledgers. He kept the real books hardwired to a local isolated network entirely air-gapped from the rest of the company to prevent external hacking. He thought he was being incredibly smart. He did not realize that an air-gapped server is completely defenseless if the hacker is physically sitting in your leather desk chair. I sat down at the heavy desk, pushing a silver-framed photo of Darnell out of my way. I booted up the primary monitor. The screen flared to life, demanding a complex multi-tier alphanumeric password and a retinal scan. I did not even bother touching the keyboard. I reached under the desk, tracing my fingers along the back panel of the server tower until I found the primary diagnostic USB port. I inserted Simone's quantum flash drive directly into the port. The tiny metal stick instantly began pulsing with a rapid, violent blue light. The localized decryption worm flooded into Richard's isolated network, aggressively tearing through the firewalls and bypassing the biometric security protocols in a matter of seconds. I watched the screen flicker go completely black, and then instantly reboot into the core administrative directory I was in. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, executing lightning-fast search queries. I bypassed the dummy folders filled with fake sanitized tax returns and dug straight into the hidden partitioned drives Simone had mapped out for me. I found the master directory labeled with a seemingly innocuous string of numbers. I cracked the folder open. It was all there. A massive, undeniable treasure trove of absolute corporate treason. I opened the primary ledger files, line after line of offshore wire transfers funneled through dummy corporations in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. I found the internal memos explicitly detailing the illegal extraction of funds from their elderly clients' retirement trusts. I found the heavily leveraged mortgage documents proving the estate, the cars, and the firm itself were completely owned by the banks. And right at the top of the recent activity log, I found the digital footprint of their $15 million balloon payment glowing like a massive radioactive warning sign. But the most damning piece of evidence was sitting in a separate folder titled Project Aegis. I opened it and found a fully drafted, unsigned contract between Sterling Wealth Management and a notorious tech syndicate based in St. Petersburg. The contract clearly outlined the sale of my proprietary predictive algorithm for a sum of $20 million in untraceable cryptocurrency. They had already set up the digital wallets to receive the funds the moment the stolen code was verified. My jaw tightened. The absolute arrogance of these men was staggering. They had mapped out my entire destruction on a spreadsheet. I initiated a mass data transfer copying every single file, ledger, email, and contract from the hidden directory onto my encrypted quantum drive. The progress bar moved agonizingly slowly, creeping from 20% to 40%. The muffled sound of applause echoed through the thick mahogany doors. The champagne tower had been poured. Richard was beginning his speech. He was out there, standing under a crystal chandelier, smiling warmly at the very people he had been systematically robbing blind for the last 5 years, raising a glass to his family's honor and integrity. The progress bar hit 80%. My heart hammered against my ribs. The 12-minute window Simone warned me about was rapidly closing. I kept my eyes locked on the screen, willing the data to move faster. 90%, 95%, 100%, transfer complete. I ripped the quantum drive from the server port, instantly killing the connection. The monitor flashed black and reverted to the locked login screen, leaving absolutely no digital trace of the physical breach. I slid the metal drive safely back into the hidden pocket of my gown. But I was not finished. Pulling a drive was only half the mission. I needed to pull the trigger. I pulled my secure smartphone from my clutch. I opened a highly encrypted peer-to-peer messaging application. I tapped on a contact simply labeled Director Hughes. He was a senior operative in the FBI's white-collar crime division, a man I had worked alongside during a massive federal cybersecurity audit 3 years ago. We had maintained a quiet, mutually beneficial professional relationship ever since. I attached a compressed, heavily encrypted zip file containing the first 10 pages of Richard's offshore wire transfer ledgers and the St. Petersburg contract. It was a massive, bloody piece of bait. I typed a rapid, concise message. The Sterling Wealth Management $15 million deficit is real. The Ponzi scheme is active. Full, unencrypted ledgers and proof of international wire fraud secured. I have the drive. The entire executive board is currently gathered at the Sterling estate in Buckhead. I suggest you lock down the perimeter before they try to board a private jet. I hit send. The message vanished into the encrypted ether, delivering the final fatal blow directly to the federal authorities. I stood up, smoothed the expensive crimson silk of my gown, and walked calmly toward the heavy mahogany door. I unlocked the deadbolt, checked the hallway to ensure it was clear, and slipped back out into the corridor. I moved with fluid, unhurried grace, retracing my steps toward the booming, joyous noise of the grand ballroom. When I emerged from the arched hallway, the room was erupting in massive, enthusiastic applause. Richard Sterling was standing on a raised platform, a crystal flute raised high in the air, his face glowing with absolute triumph. Darnell was standing right beside the stage, looking frantically through the crowd. The second he spotted my crimson dress, a look of immense relief washed over his face. He pushed his way through the wealthy investors and politicians rushing over to me and wrapping his arm tightly around my waist. "Where did you go, baby?" he whispered, pulling me close. "You missed my father's beautiful speech about our future together." I looked up into his dark, lying eyes. I let a soft, utterly devastating smile curve across my lips. I reached up and gently adjusted the lapel of his velvet tuxedo jacket, feeling the solid weight of the quantum drive resting securely against my thigh. "I am so sorry I missed it, Darnell," I murmured, my voice dripping with pure lethal sweetness. "But do not worry. Our future together is going to be incredibly unforgettable." Darnell beamed, his chest puffing out with absolute undeniable pride. He squeezed my waist tightly, completely blind to the venom laced beneath my words. He truly believed he had conquered me. He truly believed that I was just another beautiful, naive asset he had successfully acquired for his family's crumbling portfolio. Across the grand ballroom, Vivian was waving frantically from a raised dais, her diamond necklace throwing fractured light across the velvet curtains. She was flanked by a prominent state senator and the CEO of a major regional bank, exactly the kind of high-value targets the Sterlings needed to keep their fraudulent enterprise afloat for a few more desperate weeks. "They are calling for photographs," Darnell said, glancing toward his mother with a look of eager obedience. "I need to go shake hands with the senator." "Are you sure you are all right waiting here for a moment?" "Go," I urged, gently placing a perfectly manicured hand flat against his chest and giving him a slight, encouraging push. "I want to fix my lipstick before the professional photographer comes around anyway. I will meet you by the champagne tower in 5 minutes." Darnell leaned down, kissing my cheek with a practiced camera-ready smile, and then vanished into the sea of silk satin and tailored tuxedos. I watched him go, my expression remaining pleasantly frozen, but my mind was operating at 1,000 frames per second. The encrypted quantum drive felt heavy and solid against my thigh, a digital nuclear warhead resting silently inside my gown. The transfer was complete. The FBI was currently mobilizing. The timer was officially ticking down to absolute zero. I just needed to maintain my cover for a few more minutes until the federal agents breached the front gates. I turned smoothly on my heels and walked away from the crowded ballroom floor, navigating the opulent, winding corridors of the Buckhead estate. I headed toward the lavish downstairs powder room, seeking a brief moment of quiet to steady my adrenaline. The music from the live jazz band faded into a dull, rhythmic thumping as I moved further into the residential wing. I pushed open the heavy, ornate door of the powder room. The space was obscenely luxurious, designed to resemble a high-end spa rather than a simple restroom. The walls were clad in pale rose quartz marble, illuminated by golden sconces that cast a flattering, warm glow over the pristine space. A velvet chaise lounge sat in the corner, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive, imported lilies. I walked over to the massive gilded mirror, resting my clutch on the cool marble vanity. I took a deep, centering breath, meeting my own dark, calculating gaze in the reflection. The heavy oak door behind me suddenly swung shut with a violent, aggressive slam. The brass deadbolt engaged with a sharp, echoing click. I did not flinch. I did not jump. I simply shifted my eyes to the mirror, watching the reflection of the woman who had just locked us inside. Chloe stepped out of the shadows near the velvet lounge. She was wearing an emerald green designer gown that cost more than most people made in a year, her blonde hair sleek and perfectly straightened. She held a sleek silver smartphone in her left hand and a slim black leather folio in her right. Her face was twisted into a malicious, arrogant smirk that perfectly mirrored her mother's predatory nature. She looked like a predator who had finally cornered a helpless rabbit. "Leaving the party so soon?" Chloe asked, her voice dripping with toxic manufactured sweetness. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "You really should be out there, Jasmine. After all, tonight is entirely about you." I turned around slowly, resting my lower back against the edge of the marble vanity. I crossed my arms over my chest, observing her with total, absolute calm. "I need to fix my makeup, Chloe. What do you want?" Chloe let out a dry, humorless laugh, shaking her head as if I were a particularly slow child. "You know you play the innocent, independent tech genius role very well. Darnell is completely obsessed with it. Mom actually thought you might be a problem. But I knew exactly what you were the moment I met you. You are just a fragile little social climber desperately trying to secure a seat at our table." She lifted her silver smartphone, tapping the screen a few times before holding it up for me to see. I suggest you pay very close attention to this. Chloe commanded, her smirk widening into a full wicked smile. She pressed play. The screen illuminated with crystal clear, high-definition video footage. It was a recording from the country club patio the day Vivian had ambushed me with the toxic prenuptial agreement. But the video had been meticulously, brutally edited. Every single insult Vivian had hurled at me had been seamlessly cut out. Every threatening remark about my business and my background had been erased. Instead, the footage showed only my reactions. It showed me leaning across the table, my face tense and furious. The audio had been manipulated to amplify my voice, making me sound aggressive, unhinged, and completely irrational. Jump cuts removed the context entirely, creating a narrative where I was violently screaming at a calm, innocent older woman in the middle of a crowded, upscale restaurant. To anyone watching without context, I looked like a dangerous, unstable lunatic, verbally abusing my future mother-in-law. Chloe tapped the screen again, pausing the video right on a freeze frame of my face twisted in anger. Fascinating how technology works these days, Chloe purred, stepping closer to the vanity. A few clever edits, a little audio enhancement, and suddenly the brilliant CEO of Aegis Cybersecurity looks like a violent, unpredictable liability. She lowered the phone, her eyes locking onto mine with absolute malice. Your enterprise clients are banks, government contractors, and massive financial institutions, Chloe stated, reciting the facts with chilling precision. They require absolute discretion and flawless judgment from the people building their security networks. They do not hand over multi-million-dollar contracts to women who throw aggressive public temper tantrums at country clubs. I stared at her, keeping my face completely blank. Is there a point to this amateur film project, Chloe? Her smirk vanished, replaced by a cold, hardened glare. The point, Jasmine, is that I have this video queued up and ready to send to a network of anonymous burner accounts. I have the direct email addresses of every single board member at your top 3 client accounts. I have connections at 2 major tech blogs who would love to run a story about the rising star of Atlanta's tech scene having a violent public meltdown. She slammed the black leather folio down onto the marble counter right next to my clutch. If I press send, your professional reputation is completely incinerated before midnight. Chloe threatened, her voice dropping into a harsh, commanding register. Your clients will drop your firm by tomorrow morning. Your investors will pull their funding. Aegis will be bankrupt in a week, and you will be completely ruined. She flipped the leather folio open. Inside rested a crisp legal document. I recognized the dense, obfuscated formatting immediately. It was the intellectual property transfer agreement. They had stripped the algorithm theft out of the prenuptial agreement and turned it into a standalone contract. My father and Darnell decided that waiting for the wedding to finalize the intellectual property transfer was simply too messy, Chloe explained, pulling a heavy gold fountain pen from the spine of the folio. So, we are going to simplify things right now. This document is a direct, irrevocable licensing agreement. It instantly transfers the exclusive global rights of your predictive algorithm directly to Sterling Wealth Management. She picked up the gold pen and held it out toward me, the metal gleaming under the powder room lights. You are going to sign this document right now on this marble counter, Chloe demanded, her tone vibrating with absolute authority. You are going to hand over your algorithm as a beautiful little wedding gift to our family. If you sign it, the video gets permanently deleted, and you get to marry my brother and enjoy the Sterling lifestyle. If you refuse, I press send, and you lose absolutely everything you have ever built. Chloe stood there, breathing heavily, completely intoxicated by her own perceived power. She thought she was executing a brilliant, flawless corporate extortion. She thought she had outmaneuvered a seasoned cybersecurity architect in a fancy bathroom. She believed she held my entire future hostage in the palm of her manicured hand. I looked at the silver smartphone. I looked at the legal document, demanding the rights to my life's work. I looked at the gold fountain pen suspended in the space between us. I did not flinch. I did not argue. I did not show a single microscopic fraction of panic. I let out a slow, quiet breath, reached forward, and calmly took the gold pen from her hand. Chloe let out a sharp, triumphant exhale, a massive grin spreading across her face. Good girl, she mocked, crossing her arms over her chest. I knew you were smart enough to see reason. Just sign on the dotted line at the bottom of the page, Jasmine. It is better this way. I leaned over the marble vanity. I placed the tip of the heavy gold pen against the crisp white paper of their fraudulent contract. I did not look at the document. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Chloe's smug, victorious face in the vanity mirror. I held her gaze with terrifying, unblinking intensity. Without breaking eye contact, I dragged the pen across the signature line. I did not sign my name. I did not sign a variation of my name. I pressed the gold nib down hard and scrawled a massive, completely illegible looping cartoon signature that legally bound absolutely no one. I finished it with a sharp, aggressive underline that nearly tore through the thick parchment. I dropped the gold pen. It clattered loudly against the rose quartz marble. I stood up straight, turning away from the mirror to face her directly. I took one slow, deliberate step forward, invading her personal space. The triumphant smile on Chloe's face faltered slightly, a tiny flicker of confusion registering in her eyes as she realized I was not acting like a broken, defeated victim. I leaned in, bringing my face mere inches from hers. I could smell the sharp, alcoholic tang of the champagne on her breath. I promise to give your family a wedding gift tonight that Atlanta will never ever forget. I whispered, my voice dropping to a deadly hollow hush. Chloe blinked, her brow furrowing in irritation. She reached around me, snatching the leather folio off the counter and snapping it shut without even looking at the ink on the page. She thought she had won. She thought the battle was over. You made the right choice, Chloe sneered, stepping back toward the door and unlocking the heavy brass deadbolt. Welcome to the family, Jasmine. Try to smile for the cameras. She pulled the heavy oak door open and marched out into the hallway, her emerald gown swishing aggressively as she hurried back toward the ballroom to deliver her useless prize to Richard and Darnell. I stood alone in the quiet, gleaming powder room for exactly 10 seconds. I smoothed the crimson silk of my dress. I checked my reflection one final time, ensuring my posture was flawless and my expression was perfectly serene. The Sterlings had played their final card. They had completely exhausted their ammunition. I stepped out of the powder room and walked down the hallway, heading straight toward the grand ballroom. The distant wail of police sirens was just beginning to bleed through the heavy reinforced walls of the Buckhead estate. The grand finale had officially arrived. I stepped out of the arched hallway and let the overwhelming sensory wave of the grand ballroom wash over me. The space was a breathtaking monument to financial excess. Massive crystal chandeliers hung suspended from the vaulted ceiling, casting a brilliant, warm glow over the sea of Atlanta's most elite citizens. Waiters in pristine white jackets navigated the dense crowd, balancing silver trays loaded with delicate hors d'oeuvres and towering flutes of vintage champagne. A live jazz quartet played a smooth, upbeat melody from the corner stage, providing the perfect soundtrack for a room full of people who firmly believed they owned the world. I glided through the crowd, my crimson silk gown catching the light with every step. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my expression radiating pure, untroubled joy. I nodded politely to a city councilman and offered a gracious smile to a real estate magnate, playing the role of the incredibly lucky future bride to absolute perfection. Darnell was waiting for me exactly where he promised, standing near a magnificent 5-tier champagne tower that dominated the center of the room. As I approached, his eyes lit up. He reached out, wrapping a possessive hand around my waist and pulling me tightly against his side. He leaned down, his breath warm against my ear, whispering about how perfect everything was going. He was completely intoxicated by his own perceived victory, entirely blind to the fact that the woman standing beside him had just armed a digital bomb beneath his feet. Right at that moment, a sharp ringing sound pierced the smooth jazz music. Richard Sterling stood on the raised stage at the front of the ballroom. He was tapping a silver spoon against the rim of his crystal champagne flute. The sharp, clear chimes echoed through the massive room, instantly commanding the attention of every single politician, investor, and socialite present. The jazz quartet smoothly faded their instruments into silence. The low murmur of wealthy conversation dissolved into a respectful, expectant hush. Richard looked absolutely magnificent. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo that draped flawlessly across his shoulders. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his posture radiated the supreme, unshakable confidence of an apex predator who had never once faced a consequence. He beamed down at the sea of faces, absorbing their silent admiration like oxygen, friends, family, and esteemed colleagues. Richard began, his deep, resonant voice amplified perfectly by the ballroom's state-of-the-art sound system. Thank you all for gathering here tonight in our home. We are here to celebrate love, to celebrate the future, and most importantly, to celebrate the continued expansion of our family. He gestured broadly with his free hand, sweeping it over the crowd before pointing directly at Darnell and me. The spotlight instantly shifted, illuminating us in a harsh, bright circle of light. Darnell puffed his chest out proudly, his grip tightening around my waist. I smiled brightly, letting my eyes widen with feigned, humble appreciation. When I look at my son, Richard continued, his voice swelling with manufactured emotion, I see the absolute best of us. I see the ambition, the drive, and the flawless integrity that has defined our family for generations. The untouchable, sterling bloodline is a legacy of excellence, a legacy of wealth built on trust, and a legacy of power built on brilliant execution. We do not just invite anyone into this circle, we protect our own, we elevate our own. Richard stepped forward on the stage, looking directly down at me. The arrogant, condescending smirk on his face was so massive it practically radiated its own gravitational pull. In the front row, I could see Vivian and Chloe standing side by side. Chloe was clutching her designer purse, looking at me with a vicious, knowing sneer. She genuinely believed her crude bathroom blackmail had secured their financial salvation. She believed I was entirely broken. And then Richard said, his voice dropping into a tone of mock paternal warmth, "There is Jasmine. A remarkable young woman who has built a charming little tech company all on her own. We are so incredibly thrilled to welcome her into our family fold. By marrying Darnell, she is stepping into a reality of absolute security and generational prestige. We are welcoming her to a world she could only ever dream of." Polite, wealthy applause rippled through the ballroom. A few older socialites offered me condescending, sympathetic smiles, clearly viewing me as a lucky charity case who had somehow managed to trap a sterling heir. I kept my brilliant, vacant smile glued to my face. I did not break character for a single fraction of a second. I let Richard dig his own grave with a golden shovel. I let him stand on that stage and claim absolute superiority, while the sirens in the distance began to grow louder, their faint wails creeping closer and closer to the heavily guarded front gates of the estate. But enough of an old man talking, Richard announced, holding up his hands to quiet the applause. Tonight is about showing, not just telling. Darnell has put together a beautiful presentation to celebrate this milestone. A look at where they have been, and a glorious look at exactly where this family is going. Darnell, if you please. Richard stepped back from the microphone, raising his champagne glass in a silent toast. Darnell smiled down at me, his chest practically vibrating with pride. He reached into his tuxedo pocket and pulled out a small, sleek remote control. He pointed it toward the AV booth situated in the balcony at the back of the room and pressed the primary button. The massive crystal chandeliers instantly dimmed, plunging the opulent ballroom into a dramatic theatrical shadow. A collective murmur of anticipation rippled through the 200 guests. At the front of the room behind the stage, a massive 30-foot projector screen began to descend smoothly from the vaulted ceiling. The mechanical whir of the motor was the only sound in the cavernous space. Darnell squeezed my waist again. "You are going to love this," he whispered confidently. I did not say a word. I just kept smiling, staring straight ahead at the blank white canvas unrolling before us. What Darnell did not know, and what Richard's expensive security team completely failed to realize, was that the mansion's centralized audiovisual network was hardwired into the exact same localized mainframe I had just breached in the study. When I unleashed Simone's decryption worm to rip the financial ledgers from the air-gapped server, I did not just copy the files. I completely rerouted the primary output protocol. I hijacked the entire display matrix. The giant screen locked into place. The high-definition projector mounted on the balcony flared to life, casting a blinding, brilliant beam of light through the darkness. The guests waited in breathless silence for the romantic acoustic music to begin. They waited for the soft focus photographs of Darnell and me walking on the beach, smiling at charity galas, and posing on expensive restaurant patios. Instead, the screen violently flickered. There was no music, there were no photographs, there was no romance. A harsh, glaring, high-contrast spreadsheet snapped onto the 30-foot screen. It was so bright, it illuminated the shocked, confused faces of the guests standing in the front rows. The ballroom was instantly plunged into a dead, confused silence. People squinted, adjusting their designer glasses, trying to make sense of the dense, highly technical financial data projected before them. Darnell stiffened beside me. His hand dropped from my waist. He looked at the remote control in his hand, frowned, and pressed the button again. The screen did not change. It remained locked on the sprawling, undeniable evidence of massive corporate fraud. "What is this?" Richard muttered into the hot microphone, his booming voice echoing awkwardly through the silent room. He turned around, squinting at the glaring projection. A V-team cut the feed. "We have a technical malfunction. Cut the feed immediately." But the AV team was completely locked out. My routing protocol had frozen their administrative access. The screen was entirely mine. I did not move a muscle. I watched as the spreadsheet automatically scrolled downward, revealing the specific itemized offshore accounts. I watched as the names of the dummy corporations in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands flashed across the 30-foot screen. Then the true horror began to set in. The guest list for this gala was not an accident. The Sterlings had invited their most prominent high-net-worth clients. And right now, those exact clients were staring at a massive projection of their own personal investment portfolios. A woman standing near the champagne tower let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She pointed a trembling, diamond-ringed finger at the screen. "That is my family trust," she stammered, her voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. "Why does it show a zero balance? Where is the money?" The silence shattered. The room erupted into a chaotic, frantic wave of overlapping voices. Wealthy investors pushed forward, crowding toward the stage, their faces twisting from confusion into absolute primal panic. They were reading the unencrypted ledgers in real time. They were looking at the internal memos Richard had sent to his accountants, explicitly detailing the illegal extraction of their retirement funds to cover his failing real estate gambles. "Cut the projector," Richard roared into the microphone, his polished, arrogant facade instantly disintegrating. His face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He lunged toward the edge of the stage, waving his arms frantically at the balcony. "Cut the power to the room right now." Darnell was aggressively mashing the buttons on his remote control, his breathing turning ragged and panicked. "Jasmine, what is happening?" he demanded, grabbing my arm and shaking it. "What is wrong with the file?" I slowly pulled my arm out of his grasp. I took one smooth, deliberate step backward, physically distancing myself from the epicenter of their destruction. I looked him dead in the eyes, allowing the warm, pleasant smile to completely vanish from my face, replacing it with the cold, lethal stare of the architect who had just leveled his life. "I promised Chloe I would give your family a wedding gift Atlanta would never forget," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. Darnell froze, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated terror as the reality of my words slammed into his brain. He looked at me, then looked at the screen, the color entirely draining from his face. On the massive projector, the scrolling spreadsheets abruptly stopped. The screen flashed entirely black for one agonizing second. Then blazing, blood-red text typed itself across the 30-foot display in massive, undeniable block letters. "Sterling Wealth, $15 million in default." The crowd let out a synchronized, horrified shriek. A man near the front dropped his champagne flute. The crystal shattered sharply against the polished hardwood floor, a violent punctuation to the financial slaughter happening on screen. The red text shifted, presenting the final fatal line of data. "FBI investigation active." Total pandemonium consumed the crystal ballroom. It was a beautiful, chaotic symphony of absolute destruction. The city councilmen and politicians who had just been laughing with Richard were frantically backing away toward the exits, desperately trying to put physical distance between themselves and a massive federal crime. Investors were screaming, holding up their phones, taking photographs of the projected ledgers to give to their own lawyers. Women were crying. Men were shouting demands for their money. The untouchable Sterling legacy was burning to the ground in front of a live captive audience. On the stage, Richard Sterling stumbled backward. He clutched his chest, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly as he stared up at the blazing red letters announcing his doom. Vivian let out a piercing, hysterical wail, burying her face in her hands as her elite social standing evaporated into thin air. Chloe stood frozen in the front row, staring at me with a look of profound, paralyzing shock. She suddenly realized that the signature on her extortion document was completely worthless, and that the woman she thought she had blackmailed had actually been orchestrating their public execution the entire time. Darnell looked at me, his chest heaving, his hands shaking violently at his sides. "You," he breathed out, his voice cracking with panic and betrayal. "You did this. You set us up." I did not need to answer him. The heavy reinforced oak doors at the main entrance of the ballroom suddenly burst open with a thunderous crash. The wail of the sirens was no longer distant. It was right outside the front steps. A dozen federal agents clad in dark tactical gear and FBI windbreakers flooded into the ballroom. They moved with absolute, calculated precision, cutting through the panicked crowd of wealthy socialites like a knife. The flashing blue and red emergency lights from the convoy of tactical vehicles outside spilled through the massive front windows, painting the frantic ballroom in the chaotic colors of a federal raid. Richard Sterling, one of the lead agents, barked his voice, carrying over the screaming crowd. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy." I stood completely still in my crimson gown, watching the federal agents swarm the stage. I watched them forcefully pull Richard's arms behind his back and secure the heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. I watched Darnell back away, raising his hands in surrender as two agents flanked him, reading him his rights. The house of cards had completely collapsed. The debt was exposed. The predators were captured. I turned my back on the screaming family and walked slowly, calmly, and freely toward the exit. I was halfway down the central aisle, moving steadily toward the heavy mahogany exit doors, when the sheer, piercing volume of Vivian's screaming forced me to pause. The initial shockwave of the federal raid had fractured the ballroom into a swirling vortex of high-end panic, but Vivian Sterling was simply refusing to accept her new reality. I stopped and turned back, the heavy crimson silk of my gown pooling around my heels to watch the final pathetic death throes of her artificial empire. Vivian was violently shoving her way through the panicked crowd of investors, her face flushed an ugly, blotchy red. The massive, fraudulent diamond necklace around her throat swung wildly, with every aggressive movement as she marched directly toward the elevated DJ booth. "Cut the power," she shrieked, her voice cracking with pure, unhinged desperation. "Shut it all down right now, you idiot! Unplug the projector. Cut the main breaker." The DJ stood entirely paralyzed behind his mixing board, his hands hovering helplessly over the digital decks. He was pressing buttons and sliding faders, but nothing was responding. He was completely locked out. My decryption worm had not just stolen the financial ledgers, it had established a hard, irrevocable override on every single digital control system in the room. The audiovisual network, the lighting arrays, the master power routing, it all belonged entirely to me. While Vivian shrieked at the helpless DJ, Darnell was having a violent realization of his own. Two federal agents were moving to flank him, their tactical boots heavy on the polished hardwood, but they hadn't secured his wrists yet. Darnell's eyes frantically scanned the chaotic room until they locked onto me. He saw me standing calmly in the center aisle. He saw the silver wireless microphone resting in my hand, a piece of equipment that had rolled off the main stage when Richard had stumbled backward in terror. I had casually scooped it up, holding it loosely at my side. The polished, charming corporate air facade completely evaporated from Darnell's face. In its place was the raw, feral desperation of a cornered animal. He let out a guttural, furious yell, a sound built from pure, venomous rage and the sudden crushing weight of his own destruction. He shoved violently past a bewildered state senator, knocking the older man into a waiter, and charged directly through the crowd toward me. His velvet tuxedo jacket whipped wildly behind him. His fists were tightly clenched, the knuckles turning white. His face was contorted into a dark, ugly mask of pure fury. He was aiming straight for me, blinded by his own pathetic ego, desperate to snatch the microphone from my hand, desperate to physically silence the woman who had just publicly slaughtered his entire bloodline. He wanted to physically overpower me to reclaim a tiny fraction of the control he had just lost. He moved with the reckless, sloppy momentum of a man whose entire universe had just collapsed. I watched him sprint down the aisle, his expensive leather shoes pounding against the floor. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I did not show an ounce of fear. I simply stood my ground, my posture perfectly relaxed, observing his charge with the cold, detached fascination of a scientist watching a predictable experiment run its course. I waited until he was mere feet away. I waited until I could hear his ragged, heavy breathing over the din of the crowd, until I could see the sweat beading on his forehead and the frantic, dilated pupils of his dark eyes. He lunged forward, extending a violent, grasping hand toward the microphone. At the very last possible fraction of a second, I smoothly shifted my weight and calmly sidestepped his charging frame. It was effortless. It was the precise, graceful movement of a matador stepping away from a blind, exhausted bull. Darnell, propelled entirely by his own blind rage and heavy, uncontrolled momentum, grabbed only empty air. His foot caught the edge of a thick Persian rug. He stumbled violently, his arms flailing as his expensive leather shoes slipped on the slick, polished hardwood floor. He crashed hard. He slammed face first into a large, round cocktail table, completely shattering a massive crystal vase filled with white orchids. The heavy table flipped upward, sending dozens of crystal champagne flutes and heavy silver serving trays clattering to the ground in a chaotic, deafening shower of shattered glass, spilled water, and ruined alcohol. Darnell collapsed onto the floor, sprawling awkwardly in a puddle of expensive champagne and crushed flower petals. I looked down at him. The golden boy of Atlanta's high society was currently tangled in a white linen tablecloth, groaning in pain, surrounded by the physical wreckage of his own violent incompetence. I did not offer him a hand. I slowly raised my left arm, bringing my wrist up to my chest. My secure smartwatch was glowing brightly in the dim atmospheric lighting of the ballroom. I had loaded the final lethal payload hours ago, long before I even stepped foot into my designer gown. The watch was synced directly to the ballroom's massive, state-of-the-art surround sound network through the back door I had left open in the local server. The federal agents had the financial ledgers. They had the proof of the offshore wire fraud and the illegal embezzlement. But the crowd of elite socialites and furious investors needed something far more visceral. They needed to hear the true, unfiltered reality of the Sterling family's desperation. They needed to know exactly how little their beloved Golden family valued human life, intellectual property, and basic morality. I tapped a single glowing blue button on the digital watch face. Instantly, a sharp, piercing burst of electronic static crackled through the dozens of high-fidelity speakers mounted along the perimeter of the ballroom and hidden within the vaulted ceiling. The sudden, aggressive noise commanded the entire room's attention, slicing right through the wailing police sirens outside and the chaotic, panicked shouting inside. The heavy oak doors had been secured by the FBI, and the agents had formed a tight perimeter, effectively sealing the 200 guests inside the ballroom. They had nowhere to run. They had no choice but to listen. The static cleared, and a crisp, undeniable audio recording began to play. It was the intercepted phone call I had pulled from Tyrone's compromised device while he was locked inside my freezing server vault. I had run the raw audio file through an enhancement protocol, stripping away the background noise and leveling the vocals so they would broadcast with absolute terrifying, high-definition clarity. Darnell's voice boomed through the grand ballroom. It was magnified 100 times over, bouncing off the massive crystal chandeliers and vibrating through the thick wooden floorboards. The acoustics of the expensive estate ensured that every single syllable was completely inescapable. "Tyrone, you have to get that bitch's algorithm tonight." The crude, vicious venom in Darnell's recorded voice washed over the crowd. It was not the smooth, polished corporate tone he used during charity auctions or board meetings. It was the raw, frantic, aggressive voice of a desperate criminal orchestrating a felony. If we don't sell her code to the Russians by Friday, the booming audio continued, every word landing like a physical blow against the walls of the estate. This whole family is sleeping on the streets. The audio cut off, plunging the ballroom into a profound, suffocating silence. The impact was instantaneous. It was absolute, total devastation. The entire room of 200 elite politicians, aggressive venture capitalists, and untouchable socialites froze perfectly still. It was as if all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the enormous cavernous room by a massive vacuum. The frantic, angry shouting from the investors abruptly ceased. The panicked stampede toward the guarded exits ground to a complete and total halt. They were stunned into an absolute horrified silence. It was one thing to see complex financial ledgers and offshore account numbers projected on a massive screen. White-collar crime was something these people understood. It was clinical. It was numbers on a spreadsheet. But this was entirely different. It was visceral, ugly, and deeply personal. They had just heard the charming, handsome heir to the Sterling Empire explicitly plotting a violent, targeted burglary against the woman he was supposed to marry. They had just heard him casually refer to me with vile, misogynistic contempt. And worst of all, they had just heard him openly confess to conspiring with a foreign Russian tech syndicate in a desperate, treasonous attempt to avoid literal homelessness. The silence was so heavy, so dense, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the room. The only sounds remaining were the soft, rhythmic dripping of the spilled champagne from the overturned table and the distant wailing pulse of the police sirens flashing outside the windows. A prominent federal judge standing near the front row lowered his hands, staring at the stage with a look of profound disgust. Several wealthy women covered their mouths, their eyes darting from the blazing red FBI warning still projected on the 30-foot screen down to Darnell, who was still sprawled pathetically on the wet floor. The state senator Vivian had been courting earlier, physically turned his back on the family, shaking his head in absolute revulsion. Even the federal agents, men and women trained to maintain strict professional composure during chaotic raids, stood perfectly still for a brief moment, their eyes sweeping the room. They had come for wire fraud and embezzlement. They had just been handed a recorded confession to corporate espionage, burglary, and international technology smuggling. The Russian syndicate connection alone instantly elevated the situation from a standard financial raid to a massive matter of national security. Darnell pushed himself up onto his knees, his hands slipping on the wet floor. The front of his velvet tuxedo jacket was ruined, soaked in alcohol, and stained with crushed dirt. He looked around the silent, horrified room. He looked at the faces of his elite peers, men and women who had admired him just 20 minutes ago, and saw nothing but pure, unadulterated contempt. He looked at his mother, Vivian, who had collapsed onto the velvet steps of the stage, weeping uncontrollably into her hands as the final shreds of her social empire dissolved into ash. He looked at his father, Richard, who was currently being aggressively shoved against the mahogany podium by a federal agent, his hands locked tightly in steel cuffs. And finally, Darnell looked up at me. I stood above him, my crimson gown perfectly untouched by the wreckage. I did not gloat. I did not taunt him. I did not offer a single word of explanation or justification. I simply looked down at him with cold, absolute apathy, watching the exact moment his spirit broke. He finally understood the true magnitude of his mistake. He finally understood that he had never been the predator. He had always been the prey. I turned my back on Darnell Sterling, leaving him to the federal agents stepping forward to pull him off the floor. I walked slowly and freely toward the exit, the heavy reinforced doors opening to let me out into the cool, clear Atlanta night. The game was over and I had won. But the absolute chaos exploding behind me demanded a final reckoning. I paused at the threshold, turning back to witness the masterpiece of destruction I had orchestrated. The initial shock that had paralyzed the ballroom finally shattered, replaced by a frantic feral panic. These were billionaires, hedge fund managers, and untouchable politicians. They were people who never lost people, who believed their wealth insulated them from consequence. Seeing their retirement trusts, their shell companies, and their offshore safety nets zeroed out on a 30-foot projector screen triggered a mass uncontrollable hysteria. The elegant, refined veneer of Atlanta's high society completely vanished in a matter of seconds. Men in bespoke tailored tuxedos were shouting spittle flying from their lips as they aggressively shoved past the frozen catering staff, desperately demanding answers from the empty stage. Women in imported designer gowns abandoned their composure, entirely pushing through the dense crowd to reach the exits. The dim romantic lighting of the ballroom was suddenly illuminated by the harsh, blue glow of 200 smartphone screens. Atlanta's absolute elite were furiously dialing their lawyers, their wealth managers, and their crisis public relations teams. The jazz band had long since abandoned their instruments, fleeing the stage in terror. The opulent Buckhead estate had transformed into a sinking, burning ship, and the rats were scrambling for lifeboats. They realized their money was gone, stolen by the very men who had poured them vintage champagne just 20 minutes ago. Up on the raised dais, Richard Sterling was physically and psychologically disintegrating. The federal agent who had initially grabbed him was momentarily distracted, forced to physically push back a surging, furious group of defrauded investors demanding their stolen millions. Richard saw his tiny window of opportunity. He looked past the flashing red numbers on the massive projector, past his weeping wife, and locked his crazed, bloodshot eyes directly on me, standing by the exit doors. The total, undeniable annihilation of his invincible empire snapped whatever fragile thread of sanity he had left. He realized that his legacy, his freedom, and his generational wealth had been completely dismantled by the woman he had tried to exploit. He let out a raw, guttural roar of pure, unadulterated hatred. He violently shoved the distracted agent aside, his heavy frame fueled by the desperate, toxic adrenaline of a ruined patriarch. "You destroyed my family!" Richard screamed, his voice tearing through the chaotic din of the panicked ballroom. He scrambled off the stage, his expensive leather shoes slipping dangerously on the champagne-soaked hardwood floor. "You ruined everything." He was charging directly at me. His massive hands were curled into tight, trembling fists, and his face was a terrifying mask of violent, unhinged intent. He wanted to physically tear me apart. He wanted to crush the architect of his demise. He covered the distance with terrifying speed, shoving his own wealthy clients out of his way, completely blind to anything except his burning desire for revenge. I did not run. I stood perfectly still in my crimson silk gown, my chin held high, watching him close the distance. He was 15 feet away, 10 feet, 8. Before Richard could lay a single violent finger on me, the heavy oak doors behind me were kicked open with earth-shattering force. A blinding beam of tactical flashlight swept across the ballroom floor, cutting through the dim atmospheric lighting. Simone stepped out of the shadows of the arched hallway and strode directly into the harsh light of the grand entryway. She was completely transformed. The invisible, subservient catering disguise was entirely gone. Her hair was pulled back tightly into a severe professional braid. She wore a dark, heavy-fitted tactical vest with the bold, bright yellow letters FBI emblazoned across her chest and back. A heavy gold badge hung prominently from her utility belt, catching the brilliant light of the crystal chandeliers. She was no longer the invisible server passing out hors d'oeuvres. She was a senior federal agent executing a highly coordinated raid. Simone was flanked by 3 massive, heavily armed FBI agents in full tactical gear. They wore dark helmets, ballistic vests, and carried themselves with the intimidating, uncompromising authority of a breach team. Their hands rested firmly on their holstered weapons, their eyes scanning the chaotic room with absolute tactical precision. Simone did not even blink as she assessed the threat. As Richard lunged for my throat, roaring like a wounded animal, she stepped smoothly and aggressively in front of me. She raised a solid, commanding hand, her posture immovable. Back away from her right now, Richard. Simone barked, her voice echoing with the absolute crushing authority of the federal government. But Richard was too far gone. He tried to barrel right through her, completely blinded by his psychotic, desperate rage. It was the worst mistake of his entire life. Simone did not even need to draw her weapon. The 3 tactical agents flanking her surged forward like a synchronized, well-oiled machine. They swarmed the charging patriarch, hitting Richard with the combined devastating force of a freight train. The sheer impact lifted his heavy frame entirely off his feet. They drove him backward, slamming him violently against the rose quartz marble wall of the grand foyer. The sickening, heavy thud of his body hitting the solid stone echoed sharply over the screaming crowd. The remaining breath was violently knocked from his lungs. "Take him down," the lead tactical agent roared. They forced Richard roughly to the floor, driving a heavy tactical knee directly between his shoulder blades. Richard thrashed and cursed, his face pressed painfully against the cold, polished marble, his expensive tuxedo jacket ripping at the seams. But he was completely, entirely overpowered. The sharp, metallic ratcheting of cold steel handcuffs, snapping shut around his wrists, cut through his frantic, pathetic yelling. The sound was sharp, final, and absolutely devastating. On the other side of the ballroom, Darnell had foolishly tried to use the distraction of his father's violent charge to crawl toward the catering service hallway. Two more undercover agents who had blended seamlessly into the crowd instantly intercepted him. They dragged Darnell to his feet by the collar of his ruined champagne-soaked velvet jacket. Darnell thrashed wildly, screaming for his lawyers, but the agents were relentless. They slammed him forcefully against the solid brick column near the center stage. They wrenched his arms roughly behind his back, locking him in his own set of heavy steel cuffs. The Golden Prince of Atlanta's elite society was currently pinned against a wall. His face bruised and his dignity completely shattered, whimpering as the cold metal bit into his wrists. Simone stepped over Richard's thrashing body on the floor. She reached to her tactical belt and unclipped a small, heavy black megaphone. She raised it to her lips, ensuring her voice would drown out the panicked screams of the defrauded investors. "Richard Sterling! Darnell Sterling!" Simone announced, her amplified voice booming across the grand ballroom. "You are both under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and attempted grand larceny. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." The reality of the Miranda warning echoing loudly through their own opulent ballroom was the final lethal blow to the Sterling family's pride. Live in front of 200 of their most esteemed peers, their business partners, and their elite social circle, Richard and Darnell were being treated like common street criminals. Vivian Sterling, who had been watching the violent, humiliating takedown from the edge of the stage, finally broke. She let out a piercing, shattered, hysterical wail that chilled the blood of everyone in the room. Her legs simply gave out beneath her. She dropped heavily to her knees on the hardwood floor, the expensive silk of her designer gown soaking up the puddles of spilled champagne and crushed orchids. She wrapped her arms tightly around her own torso, rocking back and forth as she sobbed uncontrollably. Her perfect, flawless makeup was running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. The heavy, fraudulent diamond necklace around her throat looked like a cruel shackle. The untouchable matriarch of the Sterling Empire was reduced to a weeping, broken, pathetic mess on the floor of her own ruined castle. The 200 elite guests, the very people the Sterlings had spent their entire lives trying to impress, manipulate and rob, stood in a wide, terrified circle around the carnage. They watched in absolute horrified fascination. No one stepped forward to help Vivian. No one offered a single word of protest to the federal agents. The elite society of Atlanta was watching their king and prince be violently dethroned, and they were already mentally distancing themselves from the radioactive fallout. I stood safely behind Simone, watching the absolute destruction of the people who had tried to steal my life's work. I smoothed the fabric of my crimson gown, offered Simone a brief, respectful nod of gratitude, and finally turned my back on the wreckage. I walked out the heavy oak doors, stepping into the cool, quiet Atlanta night, leaving the Sterling family to burn in the inferno of their own making. As I crossed the threshold into the cool Atlanta night, the quiet was instantly shattered by the heavy boots of federal agents hauling their prizes out to the armored transport vehicles. 2 agents forcefully pushed Darnell through the grand entrance right behind me. He was stumbling over his own ruined velvet tuxedo, his hands locked in cold steel cuffs behind his back. He saw me standing near the edge of the manicured driveway. "Jasmine," he yelled, his voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate whine. He aggressively pulled against the agents, forcing them to pause. Jasmine, please. You have to tell them to stop this. You know I loved you. I swear I truly loved you. This was all just a business mistake. My father made me do it. I walked up to him slowly. The flashing red and blue emergency lights illuminated the sniveling broken mess he had become. I raised my left hand, displaying the massive, glittering engagement ring he had used to try and buy my compliance. I slid it smoothly off my finger. I dropped the ring directly into his shackled hands. The metal clinked sharply against his steel cuffs. "It is cubic zirconia, Darnell," I stated, my voice completely stripped of any warmth or mercy. "Did you really think a cybersecurity expert would not run a background check on the rock?" His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The absolute crushing humiliation paralyzed him entirely. Before the agents could drag him away, Chloe burst through the front doors. Her emerald green gown was soaked with champagne and dirt from the ballroom floor. She was frantic, waving the black leather folio she had used to blackmail me in the powder room just minutes earlier. "You are not getting away with this!" Chloe screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical as she pointed a shaking finger at me. "I have the contract right here. I have your signature. You signed the global rights to Aegis over to us. We own you. We own your company." I turned to look at her, letting a slow, devastating smirk cross my lips. "I signed a completely illegible cartoon doodle, Chloe," I replied calmly, watching the realization hit her face like a physical blow. "And you were entirely too arrogant to even check the ink on the page before you ran out of the room. But I am so incredibly glad you brought that folio out here. The federal agents were just looking for it." I nodded towards Simone, who had just emerged onto the porch. Simone walked directly over to a frozen, trembling Chloe and plucked the leather folio right out of her rigid hand. "Thank you for the evidence," Miss Sterling, Simone said smoothly, flipping the folio open to inspect the fake signature. "This document perfectly corroborates the extortion and corporate espionage charges against your family. You just handed the FBI the definitive smoking gun." Chloe let out a strangled, breathless gasp. She finally comprehended that her amateur attempt at bathroom blackmail had just guaranteed her entire family a federal prison sentence. She collapsed against the brick pillar of the estate, sobbing uncontrollably. "Get them out of here," Simone ordered the tactical team. The agents shoved Darnell, Richard, and Chloe toward the armored transport vans. I turned my back on the flashing lights and the screaming billionaires walking down the sweeping driveway without a single ounce of regret. 1 year later, the Sterling family legacy was completely and permanently erased from the Atlanta history books. The federal trials were swift, public, and absolutely merciless. Richard and Darnell were both convicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit corporate espionage. They were currently serving consecutive 20-year sentences in a maximum security federal penitentiary, permanently trading their custom velvet tuxedos for standard-issue orange jumpsuits. Vivian and Chloe did not fare much better. The federal government seized absolutely everything they owned to pay restitution. The Buckhead estate, the luxury imported vehicles, the offshore bank accounts, the designer jewelry collections, it was all liquidated to pay back the elderly investors they had systematically defrauded. Penniless and completely ostracized by the high society that used to worship them, they were forced into a harsh, unforgiving reality. Vivian was currently working the early morning checkout register at a discount grocery store in the deep suburbs, while Chloe was folding clothes at a fast fashion retail outlet. Every single cent of their minimum wage paychecks was aggressively garnished to pay off a mountain of inescapable legal debt. Meanwhile, my world had expanded beyond anything the Sterlings could have ever comprehended. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new penthouse office, looking out over the glittering Atlanta skyline. The sun was setting, casting brilliant streaks of gold and violet across the towering glass skyscrapers of the city. Aegis Cybersecurity was no longer just a rising star. The highly publicized takedown of the Sterling enterprise had proven the absolute, bulletproof integrity of my predictive algorithm. Enterprise clients flocked to us in droves, desperate for security systems built by a woman who could dismantle a billionaire syndicate from the inside out. Today, Aegis was officially valued at over $100 million, and we were preparing for a massive, highly anticipated public offering. The soft chime of the private executive elevator announced Simone's arrival. She stepped into the penthouse wearing a flawless tailored suit, holding 2 crystal flutes and a bottle of ridiculously expensive vintage champagne. When the FBI investigation officially wrapped up, I offered her a position she could not refuse. She was now the chief security officer of Aegis and my most trusted, indispensable confidant. To another flawless quarter, Simone said, popping the cork and pouring the bubbling gold liquid into the crystal flutes. She handed me a glass, her sharp eyes gleaming with shared victory. To absolute control, I replied, raising my glass. We clinked the crystal flutes together. The clear, ringing sound echoed beautifully across the expansive, modern office. It was the sound of true earned power. I took a slow sip of the champagne. It tasted exactly like absolute freedom. Suddenly, my secure smartphone buzzed sharply against the polished mahogany surface of my desk. I set my glass down and picked up the device, the screen illuminated with a highly encrypted text message routed through a network of untraceable proxy servers. The message was brief and aggressively arrogant. "We know exactly how you took down Sterling. We are coming for your algorithm next. Do not think you are untouchable." I read the words twice, letting the thinly veiled threat process in my mind. A new corporate rival throwing their weight around in the dark. Another invisible predator who foolishly thought they could outsmart the architect. I looked down at the glowing screen. A slow, chilling smirk curved across my lips. I did not feel a single drop of fear or apprehension. Instead, I felt the familiar, thrilling rush of adrenaline pulsing fiercely through my veins. The game was never truly over. The board just got bigger and the stakes got significantly higher. I locked the screen, plunging the device back into darkness, and slipped the phone smoothly into my pocket. "Good news?" Simone asked, taking a sip of her champagne and noticing the dangerous look in my eyes. "Just a new invitation to play," I murmured, turning back to look out over the glittering, sprawling city below. I picked up my champagne flute, completely ready for my next conquest. The screen fades to black.